Good morning, Ms. Hofmeyer. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, Chair.
Are we ready?
We are indeed, Chair.
Yes.
If I may just indicate, we have scheduled for today 2 witnesses. The first is Professor Mokgoro, who's currently the Premier of the Northwest Province, and after him we will be receiving the evidence of Ms. Memela. Ms. Memela is a witness who's returning today. She gave evidence originally in February. Professor Mokgoro has not given evidence previously. I would just like, if I may, to locate Professor Mokgoro's evidence, because it's been some time since we actually have received evidence in relation to the matters that we'll be traversing with Professor Mokgoro today. Chair, you may recall back in the middle of 2018, in fact it was, 2019 it was, we received evidence in the session of the first aviation evidence about a contract that had been entered into between South African Express Airways and the Northwest government. And it related to certain routes that were going to be established between Cape Town and Johannesburg airports, and then the Mahikeng and Pilanesberg airports. And we received evidence from Ms. Bapadi Tlatsana, who was one of the directors of a company, Coroneka, that had been appointed to as a management company in relation to these air services that were going to be provided to the Northwest Province. We also received the evidence of Ms. Patudi, who was the CFO at the relevant time in the Department of Community Safety and Transport Development. And in the course of her evidence, she made reference to the fact that the first payment that was made from the Northwest government to South African Express Airways was a payment in the amount of 50 million rand, and that had been authorized out of the Premier's office by the then acting Director General, and that was at the time Professor Mokgoro. So Professor Mokgoro provided us with a sworn statement in response to Ms. Patudi's evidence, and subsequent to that a determination was made that it would be useful to have him appear today. He gave an undertaking and an offer at the end of his sworn statement to be available to the Commission. And so we've taken him up on that offer, and today we will be questioning him about matters related to that payment. Thank you, Chair.
No, thank you.
Chair, if I may just ask for the lawyers for Mr. Mokgoro to place themselves on record.
Themselves on record, yes. They can do from where they are.
Yes. Thank you very much, Chairperson. I am Mokgoro Makoti, advocate. With me, I have my attorney, Mr. Mahlangu Ntlantla, my pupil, Ms. Dipalesa Lukele, and on his right, he's not a legal representative, but he's the Premier's spokesperson, Mr. Vuisilengesi. Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you. Okay, please administer the oath of affirmation.
Please state your full names for the record.
My name is Prof Job Mokgoro.
Do you have any objection to taking the prescribed oath?
Not at all.
Do you consider the oath to be binding on your conscience?
Certainly I do.
Do you swear that the evidence will give you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing else but the truth? If so, please raise your right hand and say, "So help me God."
So help me God.
Thank you very much. You may be seated, Mr. Premier.
Chair, just in relation to logistics for today, Professor Mokgoro's 2 sworn statements have been placed in a file that we have numbered DD32. Understand that we're entering them now for the purposes of a file number. And then if I can just indicate what is contained in that file, and Professor Mokgoro, you should have a copy in front of you.
What is the number?
It's on the spine, it's DD32. That's just the name of the file. But when I need to refer you to a particular page, I'll refer to the page number in the top right-hand corner. Chair, the file comprises the first sworn statement of Professor Mokgoro. That is a statement which was deposed to on the 22nd of July 2019. It is followed by the annexures to that first sworn statement, and you find that under tab 2 in the file. Then under tab 3, was the second sworn statement deposed to on the 17th of September 2019 and its annexures. Just so that we can understand, what had happened was Professor Mokgoro provided his first sworn statement. There were certain documents that were missing from it. We requested that they be provided. The second sworn statement purports to provide them, but as I'll deal with in Professor Mokgoro's evidence, there are actually still some documents outstanding, but we'll address that in the course of the evidence. And then the last document in the file is simply a copy of the speech that the then Premier of the Northwest gave in the first session of the 5th Legislature in June 2014. That's a document that I'll make reference to in the course of the evidence. And so those are the documents which comprise file DD32. If we may just enter the file name into the record, and then I'll make reference to the specific documents when we go to them, if I may.
Should we say it is bundle DD32 and then various documents will be exhibit something?
Indeed.
So that, so we'll say it is bundle DD32.
Correct, Chair. Thank you.
I'm just changing here
Right.
on this spine. Bundle DD32, yes. And then with regard to the specific documents, you will ask me to admit them as and when we come to them.
Thank you, Chair. We're indebted.
Okay.
Professor Mokgoro, if we could then commence. I understand that you are currently the Premier of the Northwest Province. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct, Chair.
Thank you. And what position did you hold in 2014-2015 period in the province?
I was the Acting Director General in the Office of the Premier.
And when, can you recall what particular period that covered? When did you cease to be the acting DG in the office?
I think it was sometime in 2015, once the Premier had appointed a substantive Director General.
But for the matters that we are concerned with today, which take us up to March 2015, you were still the acting Director General, is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. And what qualifications do you hold, Professor Mokgoro?
I have a BSc degree, an honors degree, a master's degree, and I'm also an honorary doctorate.
Of which institution is that? That you hold the honorary doctorate?
Toledo University in Ohio, in the United States.
And Professor Mokgoro, when you were in the position of acting Director General within the Office of the Premier, you then held the position of accounting officer, as that position is understood in the PFMA. Is that correct?
Yes, that's true. Accounting officer in the Office of the Premier.
In the Office of the Premier. And did you have an understanding at the time of what the legal obligations were of the accounting officer under the PFMA?
Yes, certainly. During the first administration, 2014 to 1994, up to 1999, I was the first Director General in the Office of the Premier.
Right. So from that far back, you were familiar with the responsibilities.
Yes.
Is that correct?
That's right.
I'd like to take you to one or two of them in particular, because they're going to be relevant for the evidence today. And for that purpose, just so that you can have reference to the PFMA, one of the files that's been placed before you is called the Aviation Legislation Bundle. You'll see that on your left-hand side. Chair, you'll be handed the relevant file in a moment. I'd like us to turn in that file to page 63, 63.
Yes, I think I have it.
That is within the Public Finance Management Act that we've been discussing and which we refer to as the PFMA for short. And you'll see on page 63 that there's a section there, section 36, dealing with accounting officers. Is that a section that you're familiar with?
Yes, I am.
And you'll see that it's the accounting officers in section 36 of departments and constitutional institutions. Here we're dealing with the department, which is the provincial department, the office of the premier. And if you go down the page, you'll see at section 38, there are certain general responsibilities of accounting officers. Is that a section that you are familiar with?
Yes, Chair, it is.
And I'd like to highlight just some of the responsibilities that you held pursuant to this section of the PFMA when you were the accounting officer in the office of the Premier at the relevant time that we will be discussing today. If you go to section 38(1)(c), and it's 1C Roman 2 that I'm interested in, the section says that the accounting officer for a department, trading entity or constitutional institution, C, must take effective and appropriate steps to, Roman 2, prevent unauthorized, irregular, and fruitless and wasteful expenditure and losses resulting from criminal conduct. Did you understand that in the period 2014-2015 to be one of your legal obligations?
I certainly did understand that, Chair.
And would you accept that unauthorized expenditure would be expenditure that was not budgeted for by a particular department?
Yes, that would also include expenditure that did not go through normal procurement process.
Thank you. Professor Mokgoro, I've just been alerted to the fact that, could we ask that you move yourself just a bit closer to the microphone? It's not coming through as clearly as we might like.
Closer to you.
Yes, or yes.
Yeah.
Either way, the proximity must increase.
It doesn't have to be too close, but don't be too far.
Okay, Chair, we'll do that.
Okay.
Thank you. So we've clarified that unauthorized expenditure would be expenditure not budgeted for. You accepted that. You said unauthorized expenditure would be expenditure that had not followed procurement processes. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. And then if we go over the page to page 64, you'll see another of the legal obligations of the accounting officer that I'd like to highlight. And you'll find that in L down the page. So it's actually section 38(1)(L). And what that requires is for the accounting officer to take into account all relevant financial considerations, including issues of propriety, regularity, and value for money when policy proposals affecting the accounting officer's responsibilities are considered. And I ask again, is that an obligation that you were aware of having on you at the time, 2014-2015?
Certainly, Chair.
And then still on that page, you'll see that section 38 sub 2, a little bit of the way down, also gives another obligation to accounting officers. It says that an accounting officer may not commit a department, trading entity, or constitutional institution to any liability for which money has not been appropriated. Did you understand that to be one of your obligations?
Certainly, Chair, I did.
And an appropriation would take place through an appropriation bill at the relevant time in the year, is that correct?
Yes, certainly.
And those appropriations are done pursuant to budgets that are developed for each of the departments, is that correct?
That's correct, Chair.
So unbudgeted expenditure would be something that had not been properly appropriated, is that correct?
Certainly.
Thank you. And then if we go down just to section 39, where I'll conclude this point, I'm interested there in section 39(1)(b), because that is a further obligation placed on the accounting officer in relation to budgetary control. It says the accounting officer for a department is responsible for ensuring that, B, effective and appropriate steps are taken to prevent unauthorized expenditure. Given your previous answers, I take it you'll accept that was also an obligation on you as accounting officer. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chair.
Thank you. Professor Mokgoro, I'd like to then move away from the legislation bundle and we'll go back into your bundle, which is bundle DD32. Now, if we could start at page 5 of DD32. Chair, this is where we will need to enter the first exhibit. The first exhibit is the sworn statement of Professor Mokgoro, dated the 22nd of July 2019. If that could be exhibit 1 in bundle DD32.
The sworn statement by Professor Mokgoro, appearing from page 1, is admitted and will be marked as exhibit, did you say 1?
1 of bundle DD32.
I wonder whether we should say exhibit 1 or maybe say exhibit DD32.1, just to keep
Yes.
that.
Certainly. I think I was being approached about that very point at the
Yeah.
time, Chair.
Yeah.
So if we can make it DD32.1, that will be
Yes.
ideal. Thank you.
Yes, the exhibit DD 32.1, yeah.
Thank you, Chair. And then, Professor Mokgoro, if we pick it up at page 5 of your first sworn statement, which is exhibit DD 32.1, you say there at paragraph 10, you're dealing with the origin of the transaction that the Commission is interested in and received evidence about in the middle of last year. And that was the transaction involving the Northwest Government and South African Express Airways. And as I understand it, you link in paragraph 10 the origin of the transaction to this inaugural State of the Province address of the 5th administration, which was delivered in June 2014. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chair.
Have you had occasion to take a look at the speech that was delivered at the inaugural State of the Province address since then?
Recently, yes, Chair.
And did you manage to find any reference to the airport development in that speech?
The matter was about the total development of Mahikeng.
Yes, there was certainly reference to the development of Mahikeng. Did you find any reference at all, though, to the specific issue of flights to Mahikeng and Pilanesberg airports in that speech?
I do not have any recollection of that.
Well, that's why we placed the speech, the text of the speech, in your bundle. We went to go and look at it and considered it quite carefully to see if there had been, in the course of that speech of the Premier in June 2014, any mention at all of the airport developments, and we did not find that. Do you accept that it's not there?
Yeah, I accept that.
But what you do say is it did talk generally about the development of Mahikeng. Is that right?
That's right.
Correct. And then you go on and say that at paragraph 11 on the same page, that there was an announcement in that State of the Province address that there would be a resuscitation of the Mahikeng airport. Do you now accept that that is incorrect?
Yes, I do.
Can you explain that error on your part in paragraph 11?
Well, the major projects that were part of the FRRP have always been foremost in my memory about that huge project.
The MRRP is something we're going to come to because
Yes.
your sworn statement talks about it. Just for present purposes, can I ensure that you and I understand it correctly? It was a project to revitalize and rejuvenate Mahikeng, is that correct?
That's correct, Chair.
It had nothing to do with Pilanesberg.
Pilanesberg is obviously not in Mahikeng. Chair.
Yes, so it,
I'm sorry, just repeat that. Just repeat your answer.
Pilanesberg is certainly not in Mahikeng.
Yes.
Chair.
And you accept now that paragraph 11 is incorrect insofar as you indicated that there was a specific reference in the speech to the resuscitation of the airport. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chair.
There were other things that speech discussed as important initiatives that were going to be undertaken by the province and particularly under the direction of the Premier. I'm going to just list a few of them that we picked out for you to indicate whether you disagree with our understanding of the speech at all. What the speech indicated the province was going to be committed to were things such as safety nets and social services being provided to orphans and vulnerable children affected by HIV and AIDS. Do you recall that as a feature of it?
Yes, Chair.
And to engage in social crime prevention programs. Do you remember that?
Yes, Chair.
There would be empowerment programs devised for victims of gender-based violence. Do you recall that?
Yes, Chair.
There was going to be foster care and child protection services provided by the province. Do you recall that?
Yes, Chair.
There were going to be food production initiatives in order to improve food insecurity within the province. Do you recall that?
Yes, Chair.
And there was going to be training of youth in various trades so that they could join the job market, which was an issue reflected in the speech.
Yes, Chair.
There was going to be building of housing units for mining communities. Do you recall that?
Yes, Chair.
Subsidization of agriculture and other small business initiatives. Do you recall that?
Yes, Chair.
And critical water and sanitation investments to prevent another outbreak of waterborne diseases that had led to the deaths of young children in the province. Do you recall that?
I recall that, Chair.
So we have a similar understanding of what the Premier was committing the province to in June of 2014 then, when he gave the inaugural address. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
What he did not mention was resuscitation of the Mahikeng Airport, did he?
That's correct.
Let's then go to what you've called the I'm going to call it the MRRP project, if I may. I understand that stands for the Mahikeng Recovery, Renewal and Repositioning Project or Program. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chair.
Now, you deal with that at page 8, paragraph 21 of your sworn statement, which we've entered as Exhibit DD 32.1. If we can pick it up there, at paragraph 21. Can you tell us about this MRRP? What was your understanding of it at the time?
My understanding of it was the state in which Mahikeng was, in quite a sorry state, that there was a need to come up with a comprehensive revamping of Mahikeng, especially given its status as capital.
Right. Now, here you refer to this MRRP, and you talk in the course of your statement about various documents that were produced over the time, the year 2014, which, as I understand it from your statement, sought to give content to the project and the program. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chair.
Right. Now, what happened in October of 2014, according to your statement, is that a provincial planning commission was put together to develop a proposal for this. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chair.
I just want to get our chronology right, because we're going to look at the proposal in the moment. But you are familiar with the evidence of Ms. Patudi, is that correct?
Yes, I am.
Her evidence indicated that even before the Planning Commission presented its proposal in October of 2014, there'd already been an initiative to get airlines to come and make a presentation at Sun City. Do you recall that?
Yes, I recall that there was such a presentation.
Yes. Her evidence was that that took place in August. So just so we get the chronology right, we've got the Premier's State of Inaugural Address in June of 2014. We've confirmed no reference is made to the resuscitation of the Mahikeng or the Pilanesberg airports in that speech. Then in August of 2014, 6 airlines get invited to make presentations to the province at Sun City. Are you aware of that?
Yes, I heard about that.
You heard about it. Did you attend those presentations?
No.
Did you know of any tender process that was followed before they were asked to come and make presentations?
As Secretary of the Executive Council, certainly when various presentations were made at Exco, I was. But in addition to that, once the broad policy statement had been made by the Premier at State of the Province address, the process of implementation would then look at priority projects, and this will become clearer and clearer through normal government processes.
Professor Mokgoro, my question was, were you aware before August 2014, when these airlines were invited to Sun City, whether there was any tender process followed, a request for bids, for example, or a request for proposals? Are you aware of that having been followed?
Once the airline initiative was pronounced upon, clearly the procuring department had a task to embark on procurement.
Yes. Again, we're in August of 2014.
Hang on 1 second. Her question was whether, I think you were aware whether any tender processes were followed before August 2014.
Well, I cannot remember precisely before what time, but I certainly am aware that the responsibility of the government, of the Department of Community Safety and Transport Management, because one of the priority projects was the airport, had an obligation to embark on a procurement process.
I'm sorry, Mr. Premier. Could you just repeat that answer, but look this side, because I'm trying to
saying,
follow it here.
I'm not precise in terms of before August or whatever, but all I'm saying is, as the process of bringing practicality to the policy initiative of the Premier, which started at State of the Province address, I was aware that one of the priorities was to revamp the airports. I don't have any recollection as to my awareness was before or after August.
About whether tender processes were followed. You are not aware whether you can't say from when you became aware. If you did become aware that tender processes were not followed, you can't remember when.
I cannot be specific in terms of time. I don't have a recollection in terms of time. All I'm saying is I was aware that the Department of Community Safety and Transport Management had the responsibility to procure like any other department and did report on procurement to Exco.
Yes.
And because of my responsibility as Secretary to Executive Council, I was aware.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor Mokgoro. I appreciate that it's some time back, but I want to be clear about why the chronology is important. Because we've established that there was no resuscitation of the airports referred to in the inaugural State of the Province address in June, you see. The first time it actually comes up is in that policy planning document, which we're going to look at in a moment, which is October of 2014. But critically, between those two events, 6 airlines get invited to Sun City to make presentations. And what I wanted to understand from you is whether you were aware of any procurement process being followed before that. I understand your evidence to be you don't. You're not aware of any procurement process being followed before that August 2014 invitation. Is that correct?
I was aware of procurement processes because that was reported on at Exco, but when that was, I don't have recollection.
We'll come to whether it was actually a procurement process.
I'm sorry. You were aware of procurement processes having taken place?
As reported by the relevant department to Exco.
As reported, okay, all right.
Yes, as reported by the department to Exco.
Yes.
Which I was secretary of.
Yes.
But with regard to the nitty-gritty of procurement, I obviously was not involved.
Yes. Does that mean that the relevant department reported to Exco, or does it mean that the report that the relevant department made to Exco included saying there had been compliance with procurement processes from what you remember, in terms of what they reported to Exco?
Yes, Chair, in terms of what they reported to Exco, they did point out that they had invited 6 companies and they had gone through that process of procurement. I was aware that those reports were made to Exco.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor Mokgoro. It might be useful for you and I just to ensure that we have the same understanding of a procurement process, right? Because the evidence of Ms. Patudi, who was the CFO in that department at the time, was that no proper procurement process was followed in relation to this airline invitation. There was no bid for proposals. There was no bid specification committee convened. There was no bid adjudication committee convened. There was no invitation to tender. What there was an invitation to 6 airlines to come to Sun City and to make a presentation. Can you disagree with her evidence in that respect?
No, I don't. Remember, you're talking about a department that was different or separate from my department, which was the Office of the President.
So if the department...
I'm sorry, Ms. Hofmeyer. Is that evidence given by Ms. Patudi, as summarized by Ms. Hofmeyer, consistent with what that department told Exco, as far as you recall? Or is it inconsistent?
What the department reported to Exco was at the end of a process that they alleged had happened.
Yes, but what I'm asking is whether, when you hear that Ms. Patudi, who was CFO of the department at the time, has told the commission that there was no open tender process that was followed, is that consistent with what you understood the department to have reported to Exco, or is your reaction that I don't think that's what the department told Exco? My understanding of what the department told Exco is different, and it is this.
Certainly, Ms. Patudi's evidence contradicts what the MEC reported to Exco.
Yes, okay. Ms. Hofmeyer?
Professor Mokgoro, that's quite an important point, and we'll return to it when we look at that particular submission that was made to Exco, which you've helpfully provided to the Commission. But just for where we are at the moment, your understanding, and correct me if I've got it incorrectly, was that when that presentation was made to Exco, you were satisfied that a proper procurement process had been followed. Is that correct?
Yes, I had no reason to doubt what the MEC was reporting to the Executive Council.
Yes, but what if the MEC just said they invited 6 airlines to do a presentation? Would that have been a proper procurement process?
Well, I mean, that's how government operates on a day-to-day basis. I mean, the Director General or Accounting Officer in the Office of the Premier is an accounting officer in the Office of the Premier and nowhere else.
I'm sorry, just repeat that answer, Mr. Premier.
I am saying an accounting officer sitting in the Office of the Premier is not privy to the nitty-gritty processes of department, be it procurement or whatever. So it is really up to the integrity of a particular department, especially the accounting officer, to ensure that when public funds are expended, they are expended in line with the PFMA, as was read earlier.
But I think Ms. Hofmeyer's question is this. In terms of your own understanding of the procurement processes that government departments are supposed to follow, would you have understood what had happened to have been in compliance with such procurement processes if you were told all that had been done was to invite 6 airlines to come to Sun City, make a presentation, and then one of those was picked as the one that would be given the contract? Would that have satisfied procurement procedures as far as you understood them?
My understanding would be that under normal circumstances, that would not. Mm-hmm. And as I recall the explanation that was given, because of the restricted number of airlines that would operate in the identified routes. That was the route that the department saw appropriate to follow.
Well, you see, Professor Mokgoro, Ms. Patuti's evidence was that because no procurement process was followed, actually, there was no way of knowing what the market was like, what could be provided. That's why you go through a bid specification process, right? You try and establish what's available, what are your needs, how can they be met, and then you ask for proposals in response to a specification. Her evidence was because none of that was followed. They simply invited 6 airlines who weren't even responding to a proposal. So they came with various proposals. Some thought that there could be flights between Mahikeng and Pilanesberg. Others thought that there should be flights between Johannesburg and Cape Town and Mahikeng and then go on to the rest of Africa. Would you accept sitting here today that that's not the way to run a proper process?
Certainly, at face value, it is not a normal way to approach a procurement process.
Thank you. So then let's move to October of 2014, right? Because it's in October of 2014 that this Provincial Planning Commission puts together that proposal, which you attach to your sworn statement. And you'll find that commencing in DD 32, that's the bundle we're currently in, and you'll find it at page 38 in DD 22. Now, Chair, 38. I'm going to ask, Chair, that we enter this as the second exhibit. This will be exhibit DD 32.2, and it comprises the annexures to the sworn statement that is DD 32.1.
It was meant to have been an annexure to that affidavit, but was not attached, and it now comes as a separate document.
Exactly.
Okay. Does it start at page 38?
It doesn't start at 38. It starts at 29, Chair.
Oh. Okay.
But the page I'm interested in looking at is page 38.
Okay.
Chair, I must make one correction. Apologies. We entered as Exhibit 32.1 the first sworn statement of Professor Mokgoro. It does have attached to it a series of annexures. I am working in one of those annexures now. Those annexures, however, are in part incomplete, and so we then need to go to the second sworn statement on occasion to get the completed annexure.
Yes.
But the one I'm in at the moment is complete for our purposes, so I don't want there to be a misunderstanding in relation to the record. I think it's preferable that we simply refer to it now as an annexure to the sworn statement, which has already been entered as Exhibit 32.1, if you're comfortable with that.
Is it one of those annexures that did come with the affidavit?
Yes, it did.
Okay, yeah, all of those will fall under
32.1.
Yes,
Thank you.
so
then I don't need to enter a new one. I'm indebted. If we can then go to page 38, Professor Mokgoro, do you have that?
Right. Yes, I do.
And page 38, as I indicated previously from your sworn statement, is part of the proposal that the Provincial Planning Commission put together in October of 2014. Is that correct?
That's right.
And this was a proposal for the Mahikeng Recovery, Renewal and Repositioning Project. Is that right?
That's right.
And this is the first time, Professor Mokgoro, that we were able to pick up a reference to the airports. And it is here. It's on page 38. Can you read for us the second line in that table that's presented on page 38?
Upgrading of the Mahikeng Airport.
And what were the milestones? What was going to happen with this upgrading of the airport?
Upgrading runway, obtaining international status, attain a freight hub, establishment of a logistic hub, solar module calls.
Right, and who was to be the
Cells, rather.
Yes, solar module cells, correct. And who is to be the implementing agency of this initiative?
I cannot recall.
If you look at the next column, it's headed implementing agency. Which department is reflected there?
Department of Public Works and Roads.
That's not the Department of Community Safety and Transport Development.
No, it is not.
Right. And who is going to be consulted? That's the next column.
Enterprise Development Department, Mahike Municipality.
And what was the target date for this?
March 2018.
I think that's actually 16 on a
yeah.
better
Yeah,
copy.
2016.
Yes.
16.
And thank you. So that was the upgrading of the Mahikeng Airport, which according to this proposal was going to be undertaken by the Department of Public Works and Roads. Is that correct?
That's right.
I could find no reference in this proposal to upgrading of the Pilanesberg Airport. Was there any mention of it that you're aware of?
No.
And do you agree with my understanding of these milestones that were related to the upgrading of the airport? These are things about getting the runway right. It's about freight and movement of logistics and solar module cells, all the sorts of things you'd give to the Department of Public Works and Roads, aren't they?
Well, firstly, the department referred to is inappropriate because it is not their mandate to do this.
It's not their mandate to upgrade runways.
Well, it is not their mandate to deal with matters of roads, on the roads as well as air travel.
Well, hang on a moment. What I understand is that the implementing agency here was going to be the Department of Public Works and Roads, correct?
Right.
Right.
As it is reflected.
As it is reflected in the
Yes.
proposal that was put together
Yes.
by the Planning Commission,
That's right.
And amongst the things that were going to be done to upgrade the Mahikeng Airport was there was going to be an upgrade of the runways, right?
Right.
Is that not something that would be handled by the Department of Roads and Public Works?
Well, essentially, the key department would be community safety and transport management. And as it happens, typically, government operates as a collaborative whole. Other departments will be drawn in depending on where strengths are. But certainly, I would designate the key department as community safety and transport management.
Yes,
because it fits more with their mandate.
But that's not who the Provincial Planning Commission identified as the implementing
Well, as
agency.
it stands here, yes.
They identified a very different department, the Department of Public Works and Roads,
Certainly.
correct? And it was matters related to the physical space of the airport, as I understand it, because they wanted to upgrade runways, correct?
That's it, but it would not be out of the ordinary if, as I said earlier, if community safety and transport management drew in other departments.
Correct. But what
such
is...
as public works.
Such as and such as community safety and transport development. What I don't see listed here as the milestones for this upgrading of the airport is flights. Do you see any reference to
No, there are
flights?
no flights here.
No. That's what was ultimately paid for when you authorized the payment of 50 million rand
That's
in
right.
March of 2015,
That's right.
correct?
That's
It was
right.
going to be flights.
That's right.
But flights are not part of the Planning Commission's
That's
proposal.
right.
Is that
Not
correct?
here. Yeah.
Thank you. The next thing that happens is that you gave a progress report, as I understand it from your sworn statement, on the MRRP, and you gave that to Executive Council members on the 28th of October 2014. Do you recall that?
Well, I recall that from time to time, as some kind of overseer, I would be required to collect information from various departments and give a progress report.
Right. Let's go to that progress report if we can. You will find it at various places. Now, Chair, this is one of those places where we got, Professor Mokgoro, in fairness to you, I think what happened is when your first sworn statement was put together, The annexures were copied with only one side of a double-sided page, because we keep getting page 1, 3, and 5, but we don't get page 2 and 4, for example. Have you managed to understand how the problem arose that incomplete annexures were attached to your first sworn statement?
Well, I was made aware of that problem, and I gave instructions that that be corrected. I'm surprised that it never was.
It was corrected in relation to the document we're going to go to now. It wasn't corrected in relation to certain other documents that I'll be coming to. But I understand from communication from your lawyers yesterday, the difficulty is that some of the documents have just not been able to be found. But we'll come to that in a moment.
Yes.
Right. So let's go to, if we may, this proposal that was put together by yourself. And I'm going to have to go now to, let me just see here, the second version that we got of this document. And you'll find that, Chair, now we will need to enter a new exhibit, if we may. What I'm now entering as the new exhibit is the document that commences at page 112 of exhibit DD 32. And what I request is that that document, commencing at page 112, be entered as exhibit DD 32.2.
That's just that letter alone.
And what follows the letter, Chair?
The supplementary affidavit.
Yes, exactly, with its annexures. So I'm suggesting
Yes.
we keep that all in exhibit DD 32.2.
Yes, the letter appearing at page 112 from Miss S.L. Mokgalane to the Commission will be admitted with its annexures and marked Exhibit DD 32.2.
Thank you, Chair. Now, Professor Mokgoro, I'm going to need to ask you to move between two parts of the file because of this issue where the alternate pages were missing from your first sworn statement. But I do have a record of where we need to move, so hopefully we'll be able to do so fairly swiftly. What I'd like you to go to is that page 120 that I'd identified for you, which you'll find in Exhibit DD 32.2. This is part of the report that you gave to the Executive Council members on the 28th of October 2014. Is that correct?
That's right.
And you'll see that at item 2.7 on that page, there's a reference to the Mahikeng Airport development. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, this is a document you put together, as I understand your statement. Is that right?
That's right.
What did you reflect at point 2.7 about that development?
Well, it says 2.7, refurbish Mahikeng Airport to establish airlift and connectivity to other parts of the country and position Mahikeng as gateway to Africa, SADC, passenger and cargo logistics hub.
So where did you get that new description for the airport development from? Because you'll see that it's quite different to the one that we saw in the Provincial Planning Commission's document. Where did you come up with that new characterization of the development?
Well, as is the nature of some of these policy initiatives, from time to time, implementation changes depending on what principles pronounced at policy level. Yeah.
Who are the principles you're referring to there?
Policy making.
I beg your pardon? Exco.
Policy making of any provincial government.
So between the Planning Commission's proposal, which also occurred in October, and you putting this report together, which principles had you spoken to about this new characterization of the development?
Well, I can only venture, because as you can see, it's quite a while ago, that it might have been as part of the evolution of policy you have a broad policy that says revamp the airport, and there are so many project components that would get into that.
In your report, you also identified what the financial implications were going to be of this MRRRP. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Is it fair to say that's a part of your report that you took seriously, given your responsibilities as accounting officer?
No, as I say, I was a coordinator, not an accounting officer.
Right, so you were taking information from others and putting it together, is that right?
Yes, that's true.
So who came up with the financial implications section of this report?
Financial implications could only have come from Community Safety and Transport Management.
Well, but remember, this is the MRRRP project as a whole. So, and it's the financial implications of that whole project. So that wouldn't just have been community safety and transportation development, would it?
Well, certainly I was competent to determine prices of respective departments.
Yes, so would it be fair to say you were getting input from all the affected departments and putting the financial implication together?
Yes.
Right. Let's go to what was set out in your report about the financial implications. And you'll have to go back into Exhibit DD 32.1 for that, and you'll find it at page 44.
So now go to 32, Chair.
You must go back in the file to page 44. 44.
Okay.
Back in the file that has got your first affidavit.
Do you have that
I've
page?
got it, Chair.
And what you indicate under clause 4.1 on that page is an amount of 132 million was allocated to implement MRRRP and 4 lead agencies were identified. Do you see that?
Yes, I see that, Chair.
And Professor Mokgoro, can you just confirm that my understanding of your sworn statement is correct? You make repeated reference in your sworn statement to this 132 million that had been allocated for the MRRRP project. Is that right?
That's right.
And I understand your statement to say the 50 million that you authorized to pay out in March of 2015 came from this 132 million that was allocated. Is that right?
Well, that is the amount that was initially allocated.
Yes. You say in your statement you were satisfied to authorize the 50 million because it came from the 132 million that had been identified in this report, correct?
It came from that budget.
Yes. Okay. Let's look at that budget as you set it out on page 44. Because what you do there is you identify the projects that are going to be undertaken for which the 132 million has been allocated. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chair.
And you'll see that that table appears, and then at the bottom there's a total, and you get a total of 132 million, correct?
That's correct, Chair.
So in your report on the 28th of October, you identified what was going to make up the 132 million that had been identified for the implementation of the report. Can you please point me in that table to where the refurbishment of the Mahikeng Airport appears?
I missed that question, Chair.
Can you show me in the table where the resuscitation of the Mahikeng Airport appears?
No, there's no reference to the airport.
Yes.
Mahikeng beautification wouldn't be, would it?
No, Chair.
Yeah.
No, it's not there, is it, Professor Mokgoro?
I said African beautification was something else.
Yes. So the resuscitation of the Mahikeng Airport does not appear here, does it?
No, it doesn't, Chair.
Yes. And the 132 million is quite carefully identified as being comprised, comprising 7 projects, as you indicate. Correct?
That's correct, Chair.
There was going to be a design of a stadium for which there would be professional fees of 10 million, correct?
Yes, Chair.
There was going to be a design extension of the convention center, which was going to take 3 million of the amount that had been ring-fenced in the office of the Premier, correct?
That's correct, Chair.
There was going to be 72 million dedicated to what's called a quick wins project, correct?
That's correct, Chair.
That had nothing to do with the Mahikeng Airport, correct?
That's correct, Chair.
Then there were going to be security points costing 10 million. There was going to be a BOP Rhino studio for 10 million, correct?
That's correct, Chair.
There were going to be feasibility studies, business plans, and architect designs for 15 million, correct?
That's correct, Chair.
And a communication strategy for 2 million, correct?
That's correct, Chair.
And finally, the item that the chair identified, the Mahikeng beautification, was going to take 10% of that budget, 10 million of that budget, correct?
That's correct, Chair.
So that's how you accounted for the financial implications of the 132 million that was going to be ring-fenced in the Office of the Premier for the MRRP project, correct?
That's correct, Chair.
And the Mahikeng Airport played no part in that identified 132 million,
That's
did
correct,
it?
Chair.
And Pilansberg Airport didn't either, correct?
It doesn't, Chair.
Thank you. Now, I'd then like to go, if we may, back to your sworn statement at page 14. That's in Exhibit DD 32.1.
Page 14.
14, 1-4, yes. There you talk about another presentation that was prepared by the Office of the Premier, and you attach it as Exhibit Annexure TJM3. We'll go to it in a moment. You say in your statement, this document evidences that the introduction of passenger flights between Mahikeng and OR Tambo International Airport was assigned from the beginning to the department, right? Could we go to that annexure? You'll find it commencing at page 47 of Exhibit DD 32.1. You can flip through it if you need to, but what I was just not able to establish, Professor Mokgoro, is who was responsible for putting this presentation together. Do you recall?
Yes, I have some idea that some of the senior managers in the Office of the Premier were doing that, yeah.
So did you have a hand in putting it together, or was that left to other people?
Well, remember that this is putting together, firstly, priorities decided upon by those who are responsible for policy pronouncements, and the various departments would make submissions based on which department has competency for whatever.
Okay, because this is actually the first document that we were able to locate that talks about the flights to Mahikeng Airport, and that talks about the funding for it. Because we've established in your evidence already, all the other documents don't refer to it, do they?
Yeah, it is possible.
So let's look at what this document, which I understand you to say was put together as a policy document by those responsible in the Office of the Premier. If we can look at what says.
Chair, by
Apology.
departments to be pulled together by the Office of the Premier.
Sorry, so the input comes from various departments,
Yes.
but it's pulled together by the Office of
That's
the
right.
Premier. Is that correct? But you yourself were not responsible for putting this report together. Is that correct?
No.
Your report was the 28 October one that we looked at a moment ago,
That's right.
where you had that section on financial implications, and nowhere does that refer to the airport as being a part of the 132 million that was ring-fenced in the
That's
Office of the
correct, Chair.
Premier. Let's go to what is said in this document about the Mahikeng Airport development. You'll find that at page 5656. It's in the same document we were looking at, and so we're still in Exhibit DD 32.1. Professor Mokgoro, you'll see there on the left-hand side of that page, well, it's headed, let's start with what it's headed with, Mahikeng Airport Development. Do you see that?
Yes, I do, Chair.
And you'll see that there is progress and challenges identified in the left-hand column.
Yes, Chair.
Okay. Could you please read for us what those progress and challenges are that are reflected?
Departments to report on progress of each project, no funding available for some projects under this program. All key stakeholders involved under this program need to coordinate more effectively. The acting director generally in discussion with possible investor who is willing to invest in the airport development, reintroduction of passenger flight from Mahikeng to OR Tambo subsidy, memo to Exco for approval of an appointment service provider. Projects are at different levels of execution.
Thank you. So could I just ask, that reference to the Acting Director General being in discussions with a possible investor, is that a reference to you?
Yes.
And what were you involved in there?
I don't have a recollection of precisely who were these possible investors, but in government, investors come from time to time to see any of the departments.
Did anything ever happen with that?
No, I don't think so.
Then let's move over to the table that appears adjacent to that left-hand column, because you'll see that it identifies the status of the program, and then there are various projects identified under the status of the program. Do you see that?
That's right.
So the first project was the increase of safety areas of runaway and upgrading. I think that's supposed to say runway. I don't think it's supposed to say runaway.
Runway.
Yes. Am I right in that?
You are right, Chair.
Yes. And you'll see there's an estimated budget for that item and an available budget. So the estimated budget was 15 million, and there's an identification that there's an available budget. And you'll see again the implementing agency there is that Department of Public Works and Roads, right, which we saw previously was going to be looking at upgrading of the runway. Then there's a cargo logistics hub or freight part of the project that we have seen reference to previously. It indicates there that the estimated budget is 1.2 billion, and the available budget in red says no funding. Do you see that?
I see that, Chair.
So am I understanding this correctly to say that I understand this to mean, insofar as there was a project for cargo logistics hub and freight being developed, there was no funding for that when this report was put together?
Correct, Chair.
Right. And then let's go to the one that we're interested in for the purposes of the Commission's work. The third program or project is the reintroduction of passenger flights from Mahikeng to OR Tambo subsidy. What is the funding position for that project?
No funding, Chair.
No funding. Right. So that accords with what is said in red on the left-hand column of the page, isn't it? That there's no funding available for some of the projects under the program,
That's
correct?
Chair.
If there's no funding available for the project, then it should not be authorized, should it?
Not necessarily so, Chair.
Why is that?
Well, as I recall, the government at the time saw a great need for revitalization of the airport. But I also recall that there was no funding in the Department of Community Safety and Transport Management. I also recall that the accounting officer of the department met with provincial treasury. I also recall that they made a recommendation that in view of the fact that departments were not spending in the original budget meant for MRRP, that this important element would be accommodated.
It would be accommodated out of the Office of the Premier's budget, correct?
There was no Office of the Premier budget, no Office of the Premier budget in this. I thought the model was clear, Chair. What happened at the beginning? The Premier.
I'm sorry, Professor Mokgoro. Just pull the mic a little closer to you.
What happened was,
Yes.
Subsequent to the State of the Province address, the provincial government then had the responsibility to give effect to the policy priorities contained in the State of the Province address. And with regard to Mahikeng as a capital town, a process developed where departments each had to contribute an amount of 10 million towards the realization of the programs in MRRP. So once that had been done, the department, within the broad policy statement of the Premier, departments had to put in projects or programs that from the perspective of their mandates, they would implement. However, with the passage of time, the pace at which they were doing so was disappointingly slow. And in the course of this event, of this process, Community Safety and Transport Management, having identified within their own plans the refurbishment and reinstating flights, approached Treasury, and in their discussions, they then recommended that the money that was being unused should then be used for purposes of resuscitation of flight.
I may have missed the earlier part of your response. So, Ms. Hofmeyer asked the question of whether the position is not that if there is no funding for a project, there should be no authorization of payment. And your answer, or part of your answer was, as I understood it, not necessarily. Okay, is that right?
Well, I'm saying, Chair, I say in this particular instance, the accounting officer of the Department of Transport Management had been in discussion with Treasury about the need to resuscitate the flights. But in their budget, they had not made provision for that. So in their discussion with Treasury, a proposal was made that since MRRP was being underspent, they could then utilize these funds to provide for this need. That's what I recall.
So would your answer therefore be to that question that Ms. Hofmeyer put to you? As a general rule, there should be no authorization of payment in regard to a project where there is no funding. In this case, although originally there may not have been funding available, special arrangements were made to ensure that there would be money that would be used to pay for this project. Would that be your answer?
My answer, yes, it would be my answer, Chair, which simply means that the need identified in Community Safety and Transport Management was not inconsistent with the broad policy idea of revamping Mahikeng. So through PFMA, adjustment and transfer of funds, a decision was taken that since in this area we are not spending as fast as we should, let's assist in this need of resuscitating air traffic.
But I guess the bottom line at least must be, if there is no funding, you can't authorize payment. But if arrangements are made in terms of which maybe funds are moved from elsewhere to make funding available, then authorizing payment would be permissible.
Oh, certainly, as I say, the discussion was between Community Safety and Transport Management and between Treasury and Community Safety Management about precisely that, the transfer of funds.
Okay.
Chair, we're just before the break. I'd like to ask Professor Mokgoro just to consider one issue over the break, if I may, that comes up directly from the engagement you've just had with Professor Mokgoro. Professor Mokgoro, despite all the efforts that you've made to put your statement together and the follow-ups from the Commission about missing documents, I have not seen a single document that records this arrangement that you speak of, where Community Safety and Transport Management went to Treasury and got an authorization of Treasury to take 50 million rand out of the Office of the Premier and allocate it to these flight subsidies. So I'd like to ask you, I might have missed it over the break, if you could look through the file that comprises your bundle and let us know if you can find any document there that actually records, because it's a matter of financial discipline, isn't it, that you should have documents recording when a 50 million rand swing is taken in relation to a budget. So please let us know after the break if there's a single document you can find
Can I
which
just
did
make
that.
a correction before we do
Yes,
that,
sure.
Chair? I think the evidence leader keeps on making reference to the funds of the Office of the Premier. And I just want to correct this. There was no fund of the Office of the Premier. This is money that was pooled from departments with the intention of revamping Mahike. So that expenditure of any amount would be the responsibility of accounting officer that would be getting their department's project implemented.
I guess she's talking about the same money or funds, I guess, but the point you seek to emphasize is that the Office of the Premier may have been the custodian of those funds, but those funds were to be used for the projects of the departments that had contributed to it. Is that putting it?
No, every department contributed, Chair.
Everybody,
Every
yes.
department contributed,
Yes.
and departments were then invited, given the policy statement of the Premier,
Yes,
come up with programs. That's right.
yes, but once the money coming from different departments was in the Office of the Premier, are you making the point that it didn't constitute a budget of the Premier's office?
No, it didn't.
It did not.
No, it did not.
Whose budget did it remain as? Did it remain as the budget of a particular department? Did it remain as budget for different departments?
Well, it remained, effectively at a practical level, it remained budgets of departments that would have come up with projects. In other words, you have pooled this money, and Department of Public Works says, we have a responsibility to patch potholes. They would then go through normal procurement processes and then make submissions to say, we request funding for the following. Right. And all we had to do was to ensure that the project that was being submitted is consistent with the priorities outlined.
But if you can help me, I can't remember whether this is dealt with in your affidavit. Why would the departments have been asked to contribute money that would sit in the Premier's office, as it were, but money that would be used for the different departments? In other words, why would the Department of Community Safety, for example, not rather keep, let us say, it's 5 million that it may have contributed? Because in the end, even if it sends this money to the Premier's office, it can only be used by that department and that department only, its portion. So why was it necessary to bring this money to the Premier's office if that was the position?
Well, certainly, Chair, the situation was unusual.
Sorry?
The situation, that arrangement was an unusual one. It is unusual one, and the questions that you are raising is the same question that we asked. But the fundamental thing is, do departments remain accountable for what they draw, given the projects that they had identified that had been approved under MRRP?
Yeah, because it's strange to me. You see, if, for example, the Premier's office had wanted to push certain projects, but it didn't have enough funds. But the Premier had identified those projects as important or as projects that should be given priority. I can understand a request or direction that gets sent to the various departments to say there are these special projects that the Premier has identified that he particularly wants to be handled in his office. Each department must contribute something in order to come to make 50 million, for example, you know. So every department sends 2 million, 1 million, according to their ability, 5 million or whatever. But once it is in the Premier's office, it's not their money. It's now the money of the Premier's office. And the Premier then uses it for the specific projects. So, but if the position, as I understand you to be saying, is that in the end, each department will be deemed to, will spend this money that used to sit in their departments but has been moved to the Premier's office. They must spend it. But the Premier's office is the one that authorizes. It just seems strange. Why don't you allow them to go on and spend it in the normal way if the Premier or the acting DG must perform some oversight function? He continues to do so, but the money stays with the various departments. And if the department must account to the office of the Premier in terms of pace and expenditure or spending of that money, that's fine. That I can understand. What I don't understand is why are you taking it away from them if in any way, in any event, it will still be used by them? Yeah.
Can I answer that question, Chair? Perhaps the question that you're asking is the question that the whole world is asking. And I'll tell you why, Chair. There is a concept of joined-up government, where there is joined up.
Yes.
Joined up. There is a concern increasingly, and I'm talking about governments throughout the globe, where the question of silos is not effective in bringing about a collective approach to addressing matters of development. So countries throughout the world have tried various mechanisms to make sure that there is one government, one budget, with regard to programs that have to be carried out. So I think the puzzle is not only what you have just expressed, but it is a global puzzle. Some countries have tried to address successfully this kind of problem. Others have not. You see, the PFMA, in a sense, contradicts the idea of government working together. Because what the PFMA prescribes is a vertical approach of accountability. You have an accounting officer, you have a political principal whose responsibility is to account to the people who have elected him or her. You have an accounting officer who, amongst others, has to oversee the expenditure of funds in terms of the rules in the Act. So the minute you want to have funding in a country like, I think, not Australia, but I think it's Australia, if I'm not mistaken, New Zealand it is. They call it mutualism, where a government would say, these are our priorities. And you may find, for instance, when you look at the priorities, there's virtually nothing that is given to agriculture. And I'm the minister or the accounting officer for agriculture. Now, in the principle of collectivism, I have no business to complain that I want to be there too. I want to be there as well. And that's where the concept of mutualism comes. And as I say, government are continually grappling. Even in our country, we have a concept called district development model. The district development model, if you look at the documents, it talks about one district one budget. What does it mean? It means the national government that implements in that particular province or that locality, the provincial government that implements in that locality, the local government that implements in the locality, must all work together to ensure that let's leave our parochial interest and biases, but address together this developmental need. So I can understand the puzzle, and I'm equally looking for solutions to find a way in which we achieve that.
Okay, let's take the tea adjournment. It's 11:25. We will resume at 22:12.
Thank you, Chair. for joined in government, as I understand it. And as I understand your sworn statement, part of the idea behind the MRRP project was to do just that, was to have a big project that could be run and managed by the Premier's office. Is that correct?
It could be run by government with the coordination being done by the Office of the Premier.
Right. And you were the accounting officer in the Office of the Premier?
I was the accounting officer in the Office of the Premier, yes.
And you were then required to authorize any payments that were coming from funds that had been placed with the Office of the Premier, correct?
I was to authorize programs that the Executive Council had reflected on and satisfied itself that the department that is responsible for executing had actually done so. And if you look at the minutes, I think they should be in the documents we submitted, that is how it happened.
We'll look at the minutes in a moment, Professor Mokgoro, but I'm interested in the question of accountability. Because earlier on you made a statement that the PFMA is actually inconsistent with some of these joined in government initiatives. Did I understand your evidence correctly?
That's correct.
But you'll accept that the PFMA is principally concerned with accountability for spending, isn't it?
That's correct.
Right. And in accordance with the PFMA, you as the accounting officer in the Office of the Premier were accountable for any expenditure out of that office, correct?
The accounting officer for community safety and transport management was the accounting officer for the 50 million. And that is why they had to do the accounting officer in community safety and transport management was accountable, the accounting officer, for the 50 million. However, Exco having satisfied itself based on the reports of the MEC, and if you look at the reports of the MEC, they are signed by the accounting officer in that department and the MEC. It always happens in that joint fashion. I, as a coordinator, Chair, I keep on emphasizing the point, I was not the accounting officer for the MRRP fund. The implementing departments were the accounting officers.
But
and they came to Exco and satisfied Exco that they had done the necessary processes, and Exco then would be comfortable that they had done their procurement in their department.
But Professor Mokgoro, the accounting officer in the Department of Community Safety and Transport Development is responsible for approving expenditure from its budget, correct?
That's correct. Under normal circumstances, yes.
And we saw that there was no budget whatsoever for the subsidy of these flights, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Yes. And so they had to come to the Office of the Premier in order to get funds from the 132 million that had been placed in the Office of the Premier in order to pay 50 million rand to South African Express Airways, correct?
Provided that they satisfied the decision makers that they had gone through due process.
But Professor Mokgoro, somebody has to ultimately authorize the payment, and that was you in this case, was that not?
Yes, because the project was one of the priorities, and the report from the MEC was that they had actually gone through due process.
We'll go to the report of the MEC in a moment, but it's important that we understand who's accountable, who's ultimately on the line for saying, yes, we'll pay 50 million to South African Express Airways. And what I'm putting to you, Professor Mokgoro, is because the 50 million did not come from Community Safety and Transport Development's budget, but came from the 132 million that had been placed in the Office of the Premier's budget, it was you who had to authorize that payment. Do you accept that?
I don't, Chair, because there is a contradiction here. I mean, if I'm the accounting officer, why should I be expected to be the one who's overseeing procurement? It doesn't make sense.
Well, let me share with you what is going through my mind about the issue. And you can comment on it. What's going on in my mind is that an important principle of the PFMA has to be that an accounting officer is responsible for payments for the expenditure of the budget of his or her department, because he or she can stop payments if he or she thinks this is not a proper payment. She can stop those. But if she or he doesn't have the power to authorize the use of certain funds, or doesn't have the power to stop somebody from using those funds, it is somebody else who has those powers, then it may be that it makes sense to say the one who has the authority to say, to authorize payment or to authorize the use of or the expenditure of those funds, maybe it makes sense that that's the person who, for purposes of those funds, should be regarded as the accounting officer for those funds. That's what's going on in my mind. What do you say about that? And that therefore the HOD for community safety, for example, may well take the view that, may well have taken the view that, well, these funds have now been taken away from my department and have been taken to the office of the Premier. Therefore, the ultimate person who decides whether to authorize the use of those funds, expenditure, is the acting DG. So that's the person who must make sure that before he or she, before he in this case, authorizes, he is satisfied that all the requirements that should be in place have been satisfied. What do you say about that line of thinking?
Chair, I thought I tried to explain that situation.
Yes.
Which, in the context of the PFMA as it stands, was an anomaly. And I tried to explain it in the context of precisely what was happening, joined up government. And I'm saying it does not make sense, and certainly is unfair on the coordinator who's sitting in the office of the Premier to be away from a process that starts with a supply chain management from A to Z, and then through the political head of the department actually come to Exco to say we've done the necessary. Where does the accounting officer, who accounts nowhere but in the office of the Premier, where does he fit in to suddenly become the accounting officer there? I don't think it is unfair to impose that responsibility of accounting on the Director General sitting in the office of the Premier, because the office of the Premier would go by what the political principle of the department is reporting and what the collective of government leaders are comfortable with that kind of report. Almost like the person who's overseeing, who's coordinating, is the one that says, based on what the MEC has reported and based on the submission which is signed by the accounting officer in that implementing department and the political principle and the acceptance by Exco, who am I to refuse?
In terms of the records that need to be examined by the AG or whoever, in terms of how, for example, those funds were used, I'm now talking about the funds that came to the Office of the Premier being contributed by different departments. Do you know whether the Auditor General regarded the acting DG in the Office of the Premier as being accountable for those, or regarded the HOD of Community Safety as being the accounting officer for those? What was the position?
Chair, the truth of the matter is that if you look at the past 6 years, the best audit outcome that was produced was the accounting officer in question now, because I produced an unqualified audit outcome, which is the second best to a clean audit.
No, I understand that, but my question is simply whether, because now we are in 2020, the Auditor General would have conducted their, would have prepared their reports and so on. I'm just wondering where they put this money, who they put this money under. Did they put it under the accounting officer in the Premier's office, or did they deal with it on the basis that it was under the HOD as the accounting officer? Or is that something you haven't had a chance to check in the AG's reports?
I have not checked that, Chair.
Yes.
But I would be surprised that the accounting officer at the Office of the Premier at the time would obtain an unqualified audit outcome. Because that certainly would constitute irregular expenditure. But as I say, that can be verified by going back to the documents.
Do you recall whether you yourself, in terms of whatever documentation you may have prepared for purposes of the Auditor General's work, whether you put it under yourself as the accounting officer, or whether you only, so to speak, accounted for other funds that would fall within the budget of the Premier's office, but not this particular fund because it needed to go to be dealt with under the different heads of department?
Chair, I don't recall.
You don't recall?
But basic common sense would suggest that it could not be that the person who started the value chain process should not be the one who accounts, but the one who is coordinating and say, based on what has been reported to Exco and based on the decision of Exco, it cannot be that suddenly the accounting officer for that activity becomes the one in the Office of the Premier. And that's the point that I've been trying to make.
Ms. Hofmeyer?
Thank you. Professor Mokgoro, I'd like to remind you of what you said in your sworn statement, because the questions I'm putting to you today are derived directly from your statement. So let's go to page 20, if we may, of Exhibit DD 32.1.
Page 20.
20, yes. You see, at page 20, you explained to us precisely what the origins of the 132 million were, and you explained to us precisely why it was that the 50 million was authorized from that 132 million. Let me take you first to paragraph 53 on page 20. At paragraph 53 of your sworn statement, you say, I've already indicated that funds were placed in the Office of the Premier for this project amounted to 132 million. This project, there is a reference to the MRRP, correct?
That's right.
Right, so here you're saying that there were funds placed in the Office of the Premier for 132 million. Have I understood that correctly?
Yeah, as it stands.
Yes. And then if you go down to page 50, paragraph 55, you say, I've read the transcript containing oral evidence of Ms. Patudi relating to my role in the payment of an amount of 50 million to SA Express. From the outset, I admit that the amount was paid from Vote 1, which belongs to the Office of the Premier, to South African Express. And then you go on at paragraph 56 and you say, first, I need to state that the payment of the said amount was made from the funds that were ring-fenced for the MRRP project. That was the amount of the 132 million that I've referred to earlier as appearing on page 5 of that submission that we looked at, right? So I understand, Professor Mokgoro, you to be saying on this page, first, that there were funds contributed from various departments comprising 132 million placed in the office of the Premier, correct? If you'll just say yes, because the transcript doesn't pick up a head nod.
Yes, Chair.
You then confirm that the 50 million that was paid to SA Express was paid from that 132 million, correct?
Yes, Chair.
And it was paid from what's called Vote 1, which belongs to the Office of the Premier, correct?
Yes, Chair.
You were the accounting officer in the Office of the Premier, correct?
Yes, Chair.
You had to authorize that payment of 50 million, correct?
The authorization followed a process of procurement in the Department of COSATMA.
Yes.
And they came to the MEC, and the accounting officer came to the Executive Council and assured the Executive Council that all processes had been complied with. And in fact, before they came, in a previous meeting, they had actually been informed by Exco, go and do the normal process. Now, let me deal with the question of Vote 1. My recollection, as I said, dear Chair, is that surely the money has to be kept somewhere. If it is for purpose, and why should it be ring-fenced? Because a purpose had been identified, a purpose that had a collective approach. I insist, Chair, that it cannot be true that I was the accounting officer for this amount, where procurement was happening elsewhere,
But
based on what was reported.
But Professor Mokgoro, the HOD of the Department of Community Safety and Transport Development came to you to authorize the payment because they had no budget for it. The budget was sitting in the office of the Premier. That is what the documents show, do they not?
Chair, I repeat, the department was given instructions to go and do the necessary processes and come back to Exco and report. And once Exco was satisfied that due process had been followed, the money had to be released. The money had to be kept somewhere.
Well, let's
And
look
because of a collective approach to delivery, the accounting officer in the office of the Premier, who is doing the coordination, cannot suddenly be the one who is the accounting officer for that amount. And I want to insist, why should we have somebody do actually the entire processes which is prescribed in the PFMA, other than the accounting officer in the office of the Premier? I think that is a question that should be raised.
Yes,
and that is the actual point I'm making. I was not the accounting officer. Otherwise, I am the one who should have gone through the procurement processes.
But shouldn't you have said that when they approached you with the invoice from SA Express? Shouldn't you have said then, this is not for me to authorize. I know nothing about the procurement process. This has happened in your department. You should be responsible for it.
No, Chair, because all the boxes had been ticked, the money had to be released.
Well, none of the boxes were ticked, Professor Mokgoro. I'd like to take you to why I say that, if I may. Let's look at what Exco decided on the 3rd of December 2014, because you've made reference to the minutes of that meeting previously,
right.
And I said we would come to it. You'll find it at page 92 of Exhibit DD 32.1.
92.
Yes. Professor Mokgoro, I understand your sworn statement to say that you were you present at this meeting? I don't think you were present at this meeting, is that correct? But you obtained the minutes afterwards. Let me just get my notes, if you'll give me a moment. Yes, you say in your statement at paragraph 61, what was presented to Exco, I'll just read it to you, don't need to go there, but just so we're clear, what was presented to Exco, of which I was not in attendance on 3 December 2014, is reflected in the minutes which you then attach. So can I just confirm you weren't in attendance at that meeting, is that right?
Chair, I cannot recollect, but remember, I'm the secretary to Exco. Even if I was not in that meeting, the minutes would be written, and if there is a fact such as the one that is being dealt with here, that this was presented, why should I refute that simply because I was not in the meeting?
No, I'll tell you why it's going to be important, Professor Mokgoro. I don't understand what these minutes reflect at all. I need to be frank with you. They do not make any sense to me. So if you were present in the meeting, I was going to ask you to assist us in understanding. But do I understand the position to be you weren't present, so you would not be able to assist us with what was being discussed?
I would have to check the records as to whether or not I was in that meeting. And the possibility exists that I was or I was not.
Okay, your sworn statement says you weren't. Do you think you checked it before you did your sworn statement?
I should have, yes.
So can we take it for today that you weren't present?
Yeah, well, as reflected in my
In your sworn statement, right. So you would then just have been working with the minutes that we're working with now, correct?
Can you repeat that question, Chair?
In other words, Ms. Hoffmeyer is saying, if you were not present at that meeting, as to what transpired at that meeting, you would have looked at the minutes to say, oh, this is what was decided, and these are the reasons, if there are reasons given. So whatever you did would have been based on your understanding of the minutes.
Yes, Chair.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair, I'm indebted. Okay, let's look at what is reflected on this minutes, in the minutes of this meeting on the 3rd of December 2014. You'll see that there's a topic, new items, number 3, and 3.1 says proposed introduction of scheduled flights for Mahikeng and Pilanesberg airports. It reflects that the matter was tabled by the MEC for Community Safety and Transport Management, and during the discussions, the following issues were raised. Can I just stop there? Can I understand your evidence, do I understand your evidence correctly to be you did have sight of these minutes of the meeting that occurred in December 2014 before you authorized the payment in March of 2015? Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. And do you remember reading these minutes?
I could have read the minutes, yes.
Because previously you kept emphasizing, if I say in fairness to you, Professor Mokgoro, that you were relying on Exco's decision to approve this. Is that right?
Yes, having relied, Exco having relied on the political head and the accounting officer.
Correct.
Of the department.
And you see that reflected in these minutes. So let's look at what the minutes say. The minutes say that there was a discussion, and then there's a first bullet. It says the following. This submission, now that's a reference to the submission from the MEC for Community Safety and Transport Management. The submission talks about making use of only one service provider. It was explained that the reason is because there would only be one service provider rendering a service between Mahikeng, Johannesburg. If other service providers were available, it would certainly have been against the rules of the Competition Commission. Let's just stop there. Can you tell me what that means?
No, I would have to check what that means. But my understanding has always been that because of the restriction in this industry, that was the reason why they decided to appoint 4 out of those 6 who submitted. But again, going through the minutes, Chair, one would see that one of the considerations was the fact that this would have been a government-to-government transaction. And that has always been my understanding, that was one of the factors that made the MEC to reach that decision.
Okay, we'll come to the submission in a moment, because you're absolutely right, in fairness to you, Professor Mokgoro. The only reason that was given by the MEC for Community Safety and Transport Management for selecting South African Express that was going to require a subsidy in tens of millions of rands more than the other airlines was because it was a government entity and therefore not profit-driven. So your memory is correct in that. I'm going to interrogate whether that could ever be a good reason to go with the most expensive presentation. But for present purposes, you agree with me, this does not make sense, what is reflected in bullet 1. Is that right?
Yes,
It's absolutely nonsensical.
Right.
It says something about you have to go with one provider because there's a service between Mahikeng and Johannesburg, because otherwise the rules of the Competition Commission will be breached. Do you agree with me? We can't understand what that
A
means.
reference to the Competition Commission does not make sense to me, Chair. But as they reported, they went through a process. I think it would be inconceivable to expect more than one service provider to be appointed.
No, indeed. You go through a process in order to select your preferred service provider, don't you? What we've uncovered in the evidence is that there was no process that preceded that selection that would ever qualify as a proper procurement process. What there was were 6 airlines invited to Sun City to make proposals. We don't know on what. We know that they came up with varying ideas about what to do with the airports. And we know that the single reason given by the MEC for going with South African Express Airways was because it was a government entity that was not profit-driven. Correct? If you'll just say yes so that we get it on the record. You can't nod.
My apologies.
Thank you, Professor Mokgoro. Okay, so we don't understand the first bullet, right? The second bullet says, the Office of the Premier, MEC for Community Safety and Transport Management, and MEC for Finance, Economy and Enterprise Development should meet to address the issues raised by the Minister of Transport. Now, that's one of the areas where we don't have clarity, Professor Mokgoro, because we asked for some of the annexures that were attached to the submission of the MEC that preceded this meeting. And there's a reference there to the Minister of Transport at the time raising some issue and it needing to be addressed. But we've never been able to obtain those annexures from your office. We were told yesterday they can't be found. Can you add any greater insight on what the issue was from the Minister of Transport?
Firstly, Chair, I don't have any recollection as to what the reason was, nor do I know whether or not that meeting took place.
Thank you. Let's go to the then fourth bullet down. It says the HOD should have done a thorough analysis of all presentations received to outline what it means financially to the province to subsidize the Mahikeng OR Tambo route 100%. Consider all options and propose best options for consideration by Exco. Professor Mokgoro, I read that as a criticism of what the HOD had done and what the HOD should have done. Do you read it in the same way?
Chair, I'm not quite sure, but one possible implication to what is standing here is to say, could mean, yes, we proceed, because we assume that the HOD should have. Another way you use this expression is to say you have not done it, you should.
The HOD should have done a thorough analysis because they want to understand what it means financially for the province to subsidize Mahikeng or the OR Tambo route at 100%. Are you saying that can be read to say he did do a thorough analysis?
No, all I'm saying, Chair, is I don't have a recollection. However, purely on interpretation, if reading this, it could mean that we assume that this has been done. And maybe that's why the use of should have. Or it could mean, the context could be different to say, he has not done it.
Well, I'm not sure whether there is room for the interpretation that says we assume he has done this or she has done this, because when the sentence says the HOD should have done a thorough analysis of all presentations received to outline what it means financially for the province to subsidize the Mahikeng or OR Tambo route 100%. It seems clear to me that if this is what was said, what was the point being made was the HOD did not do this. That's as I see it, but I may be missing something. I don't seem to think there is room for an interpretation that says they were under the impression that the HOD had done this exercise that they are talking about.
Chair, perhaps the best way to resolve this is to read this together with other documents.
Sorry?
Perhaps the best way to resolve this is to read this with other documents, such
Yeah.
as the presentations by the MEC to Exco, assisted
Yes.
by the HOD.
Yes, but somebody who reads these minutes without the benefit of any other document, my impression would be that the meaning that they would attach to that sentence is that it was being said that the HOD did not do this exercise that is referred to in the sentence. That's how I see it. Would you still maintain that you think the other interpretation is a possible interpretation as well?
Chair, I don't have any stubborn view about that. All I'm
Yes.
encouraging the Commission to do is to read this
Yes.
together with other documents,
Yes.
and that is the best way to shed
Yes.
any light on this.
Do you have a recollection as to how you understood it when you looked at these minutes, maybe at the time, the first time what your understanding was of this, or is the position that you can't recall what your understanding was?
Perhaps without, with respect, Chair, without restricting myself to what is being stated here,
Yes,
various documents that I've gone through actually
yes,
state that the MEC reported that they have gone through process.
yes,
Exactly.
yes. So you say other documents that you would have read
Such as minutes of
Yes.
other meetings of Exco.
suggested that the HOD had done this exercise.
My knowledge has always been that the HOD had done that exercise.
Yes, and you say
And the MEC reported
it's
on that,
based
if I may, Chair.
on other documents that you were aware of. Okay.
Yes, Chair.
Ms. Hoffman.
Professor Mokgoro, in fairness to you, I agree that it's helpful sometimes to read things in context and against the other documents. Let's look at the next bullet, because the next bullet, I want to suggest to you, confirms the interpretation that I understand both the chair and I have of the bullet that we were concentrating on. See, the bullet we were concentrating on says the HOD should have done a thorough analysis. The next bullet says there should also have been a marketing strategy in place. I want to put it to you that those two together make it absolutely clear that what is happening in these two bullets is a criticism is being made of the extent to which the submission analyzed key things and included key things. The first bullet we looked at says there should have been a thorough analysis of the financial implications of paying 100% subsidy for the flights between Mahikeng and OR Tambo. And the second bullet we're looking at says there should also have been a marketing strategy in place. Do you disagree with that reading?
Chair, what I recall is that part of the exercise was a quick survey that was done among public servants and the need to settle between Gauteng and the Northwest. That was one of the determinants in terms of assessing whether or not there was a need for that. So that it cannot be entirely true that the marketing strategy was not used. And that is why my suggestion, Chair, is this must be read together with other documents.
But do you take issue with Ms. Hofmeyer's interpretation of those two bullet points on the basis that you say you read these minutes in the context of other documents, and therefore your understanding of these minutes is different because of those other documents?
At a literal and face value, I don't take issue with that.
Yeah.
But my suggestion is let's broaden and look at other
Yeah.
documents.
Yeah.
Because it could just be an interpretation
Yes.
challenge that we have here.
So I guess you might be saying, reading this alone, you would have no issue with Ms. Hofmeyer's interpretation. But reading it together with the other documents that you're talking about that you say you were exposed to made you or gave you a different understanding.
Yes, Chair, and that is why my reading of this is Exco was probably ticking the boxes to make sure that things have been done.
Okay, Ms. Hofmeyer.
Thank you, Chair. It's then what is resolved on that page that causes some concern to me. And it's actually a point, Chair, that you took up with Ms. Patudi when she gave evidence, because what's resolved there seems mutually inconsistent. Let's look at what was resolved. So A says Exco agreed that the department should proceed with the chosen service provider and sign the contract, SA Express. And then B says the submission should serve again on 15 December 2014 with a proper analysis of the presentations and options for consideration by Exco. Does that not strike you as inconsistent,
Now I
Professor
remember
Mokgoro?
when I
You
was
recall that?
questioning. Yeah,
Yes.
now I remember, yes.
How can you decide to go with SA Express and tell the department to conclude a contract if you're also saying to the department, you need to come back to us in about 2 weeks' time
With an
and do your
analysis.
proper analysis?
Yes, again, one possible interpretation was to say we seem to be persuaded in this particular direction, but for us to be certain about the decision we're making, I'm not acting on behalf of Exco. I'm also doing some interpretation here. It could mean that for us to be absolutely sure, you must come back again and clarify the following. Could be.
But if that is the position, why would ESCO make the decision reflected in paragraph A and resolve that if there was still an analysis that they wanted to look at? Why not defer a decision until you have seen that and then make a decision? What's going to happen if afterwards you have already said the department must conclude the contract, then and the analysis that comes later suggests that actually there should be no conclusion of a contract because of what the analysis reveals? So in other words, I'm saying if you, as Exco, appreciate that you need to see a certain analysis relating to this matter, why don't you defer your decision until you have seen that? Why do you say to the department, you must proceed with your chosen service provider and sign the contract? Because after that, the HOD of the department would be entitled the following day to sign the contract with the service provider, chosen service provider. But ESCO still says bring an analysis in 2 weeks' time. For what point? What purpose? Because if that analysis reveals that actually there should not have been a contract signed, you have already signed and you have authorized the HOD. You can't blame the HOD because you authorized that. You must go ahead. He acted in compliance with the resolution of Exco. So what was going on? It's strange.
Yes, Chair, with respect, I wish Exco was sitting in the seat that I'm occupying now.
But, Ms. Mokgoro, you read these minutes as I understand it, and you relied on Exco's approval based on the MEC and the HOD's submission when you decided to authorize the payment. Is that correct?
Yes, I relied on the entirety of submissions to Exco and ultimate Exco's decision, and mine was to carry out what they had decided.
And you didn't pick up this contradiction then when you read the minutes?
As I say, at face value, there is a contradiction, and I kept on referring the Commission to taking a totality view of by reading all the documents that are here.
Yes, let's go to the only other document that was presented to Exco at that meeting. There's one other document. It's the submission that was prepared by the HOD and the MEC. Apologies, it was prepared by the MEC and signed off by the HOD as well. You'll find that at page 81 of DD 32.1. So just to place this document in context, Professor Mokgoro, this is the submission that you have highlighted in your sworn statement as having been presented to the Executive Council. You'll see at page 81, it's addressed to the chairperson of the Executive Council, former Premier Mahuma Pelo, and it's from the MEC for Community Safety and Transport Management, and that was Mr. Molapisi at the time. If you go to the last page of the document, which is page 90, you'll see it's also signed by Mr. Matla Koleng, who was the HOD of that department.
Page what, Chair?
90.
And 90.
90. Okay.
Yes. Do you have that?
I've got it, Chair.
So signed off by HOD and MEC, and the front page indicates it's a document that the MEC places before Exco, as we saw in the minutes. Is that correct?
That's right.
Right. So in our investigations, this is the only other document which could give context to what was decided on the 3rd of December. We've asked for all documents related to this decision to procure the services of SA Express. This is all that came up, and this is all that you referred to in your sworn statement as well. So I want to look at what this document tells us about a proper procurement process having been followed, because your evidence has been you had been under the impression that proper procurement processes have been followed. Professor Mokgoro, I've looked in this document for some indication that proper procurement processes were followed. And the only thing I've found is at page 82. Can you turn to page 82, please? Page 82, under paragraph 4 there, which is headed Process to Activate the Airports, says the following. The department invited 6 potential airliners to submit and make presentations. Of the 6 service providers invited, only 4 presented their proposals as requested, and the other 2 were advised to finalize their proposals and forward them to the department, but were never received. That's the sum total about process. It is not a process like the process that Ms. Patudi went through when she was later asked to authorize the payment to the management company appointed under the agreement between South African Express Airways and the Northwest government. I don't suggest we need to go there, but Chair, you will recall, and if you want me to take you there, I can, Professor Mokgoro, but she had a long departmental checklist for the procurement process. That is a sheet where you tick off. You know, earlier you said you need to tick off that the process was followed. And it goes through stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4, which ends up with budget control, and all the responsible members have to say, yes, we went through this stage, yes, we went through that stage, specification, adjudication, etc. There's not even a mention of a checklist having been followed here, is there?
No, it is not mentioned here.
There's not a mention that there was a bid proposal that was submitted, is there?
Well, I don't know what precedes this submission to Exco. I think it would be useful to see precisely what happened, apart from what is stated at the...
But this is all that served before Exco.
That's correct.
And this is the only document that the department has indicated to us exists in relation to this topic. So I want to put it to you that you were also relying only on this document then. And if you were only relying on this document, Professor Mokgoro, how could you have been satisfied that a proper procurement process had been followed?
Well, Chair, I acknowledge that this is all that is stated here. I don't recall seeing any submission to Exco where the entire detail of a procurement process would be included in a submission to Exco.
So there was nothing else. And all that happens after that short paragraph...
Maybe, Ms. Hofmeyer, the Premier, when under paragraph 4 at page 82, the one we are dealing with, it says, the heading says, process to activate the airports. And that seems to be the only paragraph in the document that has a heading saying process. Once you have read that, would it not be fair to expect that it would strike somebody who expected that a normal open tender process would have been followed. It would strike him that there was no mention of such a process under this paragraph, and therefore that would make the reader to inquire more, to say, why is there no mention of any procurement process under this? Did it happen? What do you say to that thought? That somebody who expected that for this kind of project there should be an open tender process, when they come to this paragraph which is headed process to activate the airports and finds that there is no mention of any open tender process, that should have raised red flags to say, I need to find out. Why is there no mention? Was it followed?
Chair, my recollection serves me well, in my engagement with the HOD, he mentioned something like, because of the route and because of the profitability, when you take a total list of airlines, it only makes sense that these are the possible, these airlines would possibly qualify for that. And I could be wrong in my recollection. But certainly, when one looks at this, that question would arise.
But maybe one should clear something that maybe should have been cleared earlier. Am I right to assume that, based on your knowledge of government processes in terms of procurement and so on, am I right to assume that your expectation for this kind of project would be that an open tender process should have been followed unless there were good grounds to deviate from it, in which case then whatever deviation would have had to happen within the terms of the law?
Unless there was...
Yes, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Professor Mokgoro, I'd like your comment on the following. You see, the HOD, whom you've indicated to the Chair in answer to his question now, who indicated to you that it made sense to just approach these 6 airlines because they were the ones who were available in the market, is the very same HOD who was implicated in the evidence of Ms. Tlatsana as having received some of the funds that were paid out from the Northwest government. Were you aware of that evidence previously?
Well, certainly I never suggested that what the HOD said was reasonable. I'm just saying, I'm just referring to a recollection of what he said to me, and I'm not passing any value judgment on that.
You see, the reason why you would want checklists, I put it to you, the reason why you'd want processes to be followed is precisely to prevent situations where people for ulterior purposes are seeking to advance contracts with certain service providers so that they can enrich themselves. Isn't that so?
Chair, on a daily basis, the Director General in the Office of the Premier does not enter into nitty-gritty processes of departments. And that is why, in the course of our democracy, where initially you had one accounting officer across all government departments, the arrangement was changed where each department must have an accounting officer, and the Director General then became the accounting officer only in the Office of the Premier.
But you did have said previously, Professor Mokgoro, that in order to be satisfied to authorize this payment, one of the things you would have taken into account is whether proper processes were followed, correct?
I said the MEC for department as well as the HOD assured the Executive Council that processes had been followed. And I want to emphasize once more, my responsibility was not to get into the nitty-gritty. The MEC must have satisfied himself that the report that the HOD, his HOD gave him was authentic. And the MEC is expected to have the necessary integrity that when it comes to Exco and present this report, this report, then it would be accepted. And indeed, Exco accepted it. And I really think that what Ms. Hofmeyer is asking me is probably in the purview of the HOD of the department, who was tasked with the responsibility of doing precisely what she's asking, with respect.
But Professor Mokgoro, you've just given evidence that says that the MEC assured Exco, the executive committee, that proper process has been followed. Did I understand your evidence correctly?
Yes, and it is in black and white, Chair.
Well, it is not, Professor Mokgoro, with respect, because the only paragraph dealing with process says nothing about a proper process having been followed. And the only other document you were relying on when you authorized the payment was the minutes, that again say absolutely nothing about proper process. If anything, the minutes reflect that the members of Exco were concerned that a proper analysis had not been done. Against those facts, Professor Mokgoro, how could you have been satisfied that Exco was satisfied that a proper process had been followed?
Perhaps what we need to do, Chair, because some of the documents that I have gone through certainly point out that the MEC made this presentation assisted by the HOD, and that is how the decision was taken.
Are you saying that there is a document, or there are documents that might not be here in this bundle, which were to the effect, or was to the effect, that the MEC had assured Exco that there had been compliance with procurement processes, in effect?
Yes, Chair. I actually would like the opportunity just to go through the bundle that I've been using all the time.
Or to see if you can find those documents?
Yes, I think I should be able to.
Okay, all right.
Chair, absolutely, if Professor Mokgoro can assist us, but I would just like to be clear about the fact that this has been an extensive investigation that the Commission has done for more than 2 years. We've asked for all the relevant documents, and nothing more than what is in your bundle has been produced. But if there is more, we would happily like to consider it, certainly. I just want to then go to the motivation that was given in the submission for selecting South African Express, right? Because it's one of the things that clearly served before Exco, and which I understood your answer earlier to be, we must consider what Exco is recorded as having discussed and decided in the light of what was presented to it, right? Now, what this submission does is it talks about those 4 airlines from whom presentations were received. Do you recall that, Professor Mokgoro?
I recall that.
Right. And what it ends up, I'm going to summarize just in the interest of time, and if you disagree with any part of it, please let me know. But what ends up happening is SA Express is identified as the preferred service provider, and the reader of the submission, Exco, is told that's going to cost the Northwest government 110 million upfront for the first year. Do you recall that?
Yes, I recall that.
It's going to be a 5-year contract. So 110 million is only in year 1, and over the successive years, that amount will diminish to some extent, but it'll be a full 5-year commitment, correct?
Yes, Chair.
And it was being compared with, for example, Continental Aviation Solution, who is the second airline whose presentation is considered. And what Continental Airline Solution was proposing was a sort of phased-in approach where you'd start with certain routes, and then you'd add routes, and you'd eventually get to Mauritius and Seychelles in the 3rd phase, apparently. And do you recall what they were going to charge the Northwest government for their proposed revamp of the airports?
No, I don't recall, Chair.
Well, you'll find it at page 86. They were going to charge the Northwest government 4,397,725 rand. You'll find that at page 86. It's sort of midway down. It says the proposed startup funding is estimated, I accept estimated, at 4,397,725 rand. Do you see that?
Yes, I have, Chair.
So the first thing that strikes me is that when the HOD and the MEC were evaluating these presentations and presenting this to Exco, Exco had before it a summary of the presentations that put 110 million as year one's cost as compared with 4.7 million, right? Do you agree with me that you'd need some convincing to go with the 110 million rather than the 4.7 million?
Yes, I agree.
And do you want to know what the only reason is that was given for going with SA Express rather than any of the other providers?
I have no idea, Chair.
Well, let's find it. It's at page 87. The single reason that was given under paragraph 6 for the proposed
Yes.
service provider is the following. Based on the above proposals, the SA Express was found to be relevant to meet the provincial airlift strategy based on the fact that it's a state-owned entity and not profit-driven, while SA Airlink, Continental and Challenger Airlines will be highly dependent on government for profit-making. Do you see that?
Yes, I see that, Chair.
That was the point you made earlier, wasn't it? That your understanding was there was a particular preference for SA Express because it was a government entity. Is that right?
I said I recall that that was one of the considerations.
Well, did you give any thought to interrogate that reason as being the one to go for 110 million rather than 4.7 million?
The point about a government system, Chair, is that you have departments, and as I said repeatedly, each department with its accounting office. And the responsibility of the Director General is to assist the Premier in his or her constitutional responsibility to coordinate administration. And in terms of this principle, the nitty-gritty accountability responsibility lie with the HOD. And certainly, every other day, you would find things that don't make sense that happen in department. And what normally happens is that internal audit would be the one to pick up some of these anomalies, some of the things that don't make sense.
Mm. So do I have it as your evidence that it doesn't make sense?
Yes, it does.
Doesn't make sense that you would go with 110 million
Yeah, it doesn't.
rather than 4.7. Thank you, Professor Mokgoro. Let's then finally move, if we may.
Of course, I'm sorry. Of course, Premier, if you read the documents and there are decisions to be made whether to go with A or B in a situation such as this, and you find that going with A would mean that the department would pay a substantially lower amount than going to B, even if something like that might be an issue relating to a certain department. I think that if you have something to do with it, you would immediately say, hang on, did you really see what's going on here? Did you really see that you are going to make the government pay 96,000 rand more for the same service that you can get the government can get only for 4 million? You would say, no, but there's something not right. HOD, please tell me. Even if the HOD didn't report to you, but if you see that, because you would be concerned about why should the government pay so much money when it can save so much money by going that route. That would be my thinking, that it's so vast, the difference so vast, that you would think, no, there must be something wrong, there must be something that they didn't see, or there's something wrong with this document. It can't be that the one is 4 million, the other one is 100. And you would want somebody to just help you understand. Do you think I'm expecting too much from somebody who is not in the particular department?
whether or not that will change the situation, I expect any responsible leader to ask that question.
Yes,
And I
yes.
think that is one of the reasons why I would have had a discussion with the HOD.
Yes.
And as I said earlier,
Yes.
Chair, when you find yourself in a situation where you are a secretary and not a decision maker, almost at every meeting, there would be a matter that you differ with, but there are decision makers that make those decisions. And that is why, with respect, I said earlier, I wish Exco was sitting where I'm sitting.
But of course, I would imagine that where it was going to be your signature that would authorize payment, that would basically give effect to this choice, and you saw something like this and it didn't make sense to you, you would be entitled to refuse to authorize until you are satisfied. Because you would not want somebody to say, how could you authorize? You should have refused in the light of this until you were satisfied that there was sense. This didn't make sense. It couldn't have made sense to you. You wouldn't want to authorize payment because if somebody later on brought this document to say, did you read this document? You say, yes. Did you see this? Yes, I saw it. Does it make sense to you? No, it doesn't make sense. Why did you authorize? Then you don't have an answer.
Chair, in my career, I've always insisted, even today, at least Treasury and a legal advisor would advise before I append my signature. If you have a situation where information before you has involved discussions between the accounting officer and Treasury, you tend to be satisfied that things have been looked at. But I agree, in retrospect, it doesn't make sense.
Thank you. Ms. Hofmeyer?
Thank you. Professor Mokgoro, I said I was going to go back to the question I posed before the break, which was whether there were any documents that evidenced that confirmation that Treasury gave that the funds could be expended. Were you able to find any documents?
I cannot recall finding such a document, but it would come as no surprise if, in fact, talking to Treasury recently, that there was a discussion just to ensure that what I recall was in fact true, that there was a discussion between Treasury and the accounting officer in the department itself.
Yeah, your voice went down, Prof.
I recall, and indeed recently I did have discussions with Treasury as to why did we arrive at this. And I was reminded once more that it was because of under expenditure by other departments, and then a process was put in place to appeal to Treasury, and Treasury advised that unspent funds should be utilized.
But Professor Mokgoro, shouldn't you have asked to be shown evidence of the alleged underspending? And I ask that because you'll remember you put that document together on the 28th of October, 2014. You identified precisely how the 132 million placed in the office of the Premier was going to be allocated. And you confirmed in your evidence today fairly that the Mahikeng Airport subsidy, Pilanesberg Airport subsidy, played no part in that allocation, correct?
Yes, I certainly knew myself right from the outset that the money was woefully adequate for the entire revamping of Mahikeng, but my understanding of that was at least begin the process.
Yes, but you took money out of a budget of 132 million that was going to be spent on other projects to spend it on a subsidy to SA Express for flights to airports.
Chair, that was not my priority, that was not my decision.
Well,
and
it
I thought I have made this point repeatedly.
No, Professor Mokgoro, in fairness to you, you are the person who authorized the 50 million being paid, correct?
Authorize does not mean the same thing as what an accounting officer does in terms of expenditure. Treasury has had discussions with transport management. They have made submissions to Exco. Exco has decided that this money must go there. That the accountability...
No, Premier. I think your answer is yes, because her question was, you confirmed that you authorized the payment. Now we know that you did authorize. So your answer to that question is yes, I did authorize. If she wants to ask further questions, we can take it from there.
I'd like to move to the only documents we do have about Treasury and the payment. And you'll find that at page 94 of Exhibit DD 32.1. Chair, I see we are approaching the lunch break. I certainly should be able to finish in time. I have a few more questions just to give you a sense of where we're going.
Okay.
Do you see page 94, Professor Mokgoro?
Yes.
Now that is what came to you, as I understand it.
Yes, that's what...
It's addressed to you, the Acting Director General.
That's right.
And it says, Dear Professor Mokgoro, attach please SA Express documents for your urgent attention and processing of payment. And it comes from the HOD of Community Safety and Transport, correct?
Correct.
And then, as I understand your sworn statement, what was attached to it was the invoice from SA Express. Is that correct?
Right. That's right.
Your sworn statement says it was also accompanied by an unsigned copy of the agreement between SA Express and the Northwest.
That's
Do you
right.
recall that? We've asked for about a year for your department to provide us with that copy of the unsigned agreement. I understand that it can't be located. Is that right?
Is that the SLA or the MOU?
No, the SLA. As I understand your statement, you say you got this letter, you got the invoice, and you got the unsigned SLA. Is that correct?
Yes, Chair, I got this document, I got the MOU as well as the SLA.
Oh, I wasn't aware that you got the MOU,
Yeah, there was an MOU.
because we've also never been able to locate that MOU. Have you made any efforts to find it?
Well, as I said earlier, Chair, when I got word that there were some missing documents, I did issue instructions for them to be submitted.
I understand. Well, the feedback yesterday from your lawyers was that they couldn't be located. But I understand apologies from your office was that they could not be located. I've just been assisted by that from my learned friends. Right. So you get the request, please process for payment, and then you get an invoice, which is over the page at 95, which has something written at the bottom. Can you tell me whose handwriting that is at the bottom of the invoice?
Chair, maybe before I respond to this question, maybe just again a question of language. The letter that is addressed to me says, attach please South African Express documents for your attention, and for your urgent attention and processing. And the question that I'm grappling with is, does that mean the same as approve?
I'm sorry, just say that again.
The letter addressed to me, attached, please, South African Express documents for your urgent attention and processing of payments. I think I've tried to convey to the Commission that decisions are taken there, and my role as coordinator, once the decision makers have decided, is to make funds available. And this document actually confirms what I've been trying to argue all the time.
Attached, please, South African Express documents for your urgent attention and processing of payment. What it certainly says, it expects you to process payment, and it seems that you are given certain SA Express documents which it is considered you should have regard to, and then processing of payment. But I just want to understand the point you were seeking to make.
The point that I'm making is, and I thought that I had conveyed that sufficiently. The point I keep on emphasizing is, I hate to refer to myself as being a postman, let me not say a postboy. There is a decision that is taken by decision makers. And as part of the package, Treasury is involved, the accounting officer is involved, and the decision reaches me. This is a priority project, indeed, as the decision makers have indicated, and I have to make those funds available. So I then say to Treasury and the other finance people, process this. Maybe I should have gone back to Exco and said your decision is uninformed. In retrospect, maybe I should have done so. But it was not my space. You know, decisions and transactions take place in departments, and that is why there's an accounting officer there.
You know what I would have expected, and maybe somebody who has been in government for some time would not expect the same thing as I would. I would expect that if you were the person who had the power to authorize payment in regard to a project that belongs to a particular department, I would imagine that your attitude would be, when you different departments want me to authorize payment, you must send me documentation or a memo that satisfies me that certain things that need to be complied with before authorization of payment can be made have happened or have been complied with, so that there would be a memo that will say, acting DG, we are asking you to authorize payment for this in such and such an amount. This is about such and such a project. We assure you that the following legal requirements have been met, 1, 2, 3, 4, to give you comfort that you can sign. I'm saying that would be my expectation of what the government departments should do, and that's what I would have expected, so that you feel covered that you are not going to be in a situation where you have authorized something only to find that there was no compliance with the relevant prescripts. But it may be that that's not the only way in which things can be done. It may be that there are other ways, but that would have been my expectation.
The expectation is correct. It's a pity there is no record here, because I did have an engagement with the HOD. Not because I had any authority in terms of the money that had been allocated to his department, although sitting in the office of the Premier. Because, again, he is the accounting officer. He would have provided the necessary evidence to his MEC that they have gone through due process. And the MEC also, one would expect that, would have assured himself that there was process before addressing Exco on these matters. And the expectation that I should have declined this thing when the highest authority making, yes, I would advise, but certainly not refuse to have the processing done.
Okay.
Professor Mokgoro, you were the accounting officer in the Office of the Premier,
That's
correct?
correct, Chair.
Yes. These funds came from funds placed with the Office of the Premier, correct?
Ring-fenced in the Office of the Premier.
Yes. And the PFMA we went through previously requires you in that role to ensure that there's no unauthorized, irregular expenditure, correct?
Yes, every accounting officer is expected to do that. And
yes.
we're talking about an accounting officer of a different department to the one.
No, but Professor Mokgoro, we keep going back there. So that's why it's important. This was not coming out of the budget of community safety and transport development. It was coming out of ring-fenced funds in the Office of the Premier, for which you were the only accounting officer, correct?
It was money earmarked for the Department of Transport Management, not for the Office of the Premier.
No, it was ring-fenced funds placed in the Office of
No,
the
but-
Premier for the MRRP project. That's your evidence, is it
Chair,
not?
for coordination purposes, it makes sense to say funds are going to be pooled so that this government ensures that the priorities that have been decided upon are actually carried out. But procurement and transactions are the responsibilities of accounting officers in those departments.
Why then, Professor Mokgoro, is it your signature at page 97 and not the signature of the HOD in the Department of Community Safety and Transport Development? If you'll go to page 97, that's the page from the Republic of South Africa Northwest, authorizing 50 million rand to be paid to South African Express Airways. I take it that's your signature at the bottom of the page. Is that correct?
Chair, after all the decisions that had been taken, my responsibility was to communicate that. And this is what this document reflects.
Is it your signature?
I say exactly that. It is my signature.
Thank you. Chair,
Yeah,
this...
I'm sorry. This question of who was the accounting officer for these funds is quite interesting, because I suspect that if the HOD of that department came here, I don't think he or she has come here. I can't remember everybody who has come here
not.
over the past 2.5 years. I have a suspicion that he or she would say, I was the accounting officer for funds that were within my control. These funds were not within my control. They were within the control of the Office of the Premier. Therefore, it's the acting DG who was accounting officer for those funds. How can I be accounting officer for funds that are not in my department? I suspect that that's what they would say. What do you say to that?
I would ask him as to why did he take the responsibility to go on a process of procurement, because that is normally the responsibility of an accounting officer of a department. And that's an anomaly that I keep on referring to. It is a difficulty that would arise where, in terms of the PFMA, which talks about vertical accountability, you suddenly find yourself having to coordinate all departments because this policy requires participation by all departments. And I think that's really the source of the difficulty.
But of course, in our discussion earlier, I think before lunch, before tea break, part of what I couldn't understand, and I understood you not being able to explain it properly, and if I misunderstood you, can tell me. Part of what I didn't understand is why were these funds removed from those departments if they would, after being removed and placed with the Office of the Premier, one, they would still be used for the projects of those departments. Why were they not allowed to remain within those departments? Because otherwise they were going to be used for those departments. Why were they moved? Did I understand your reaction to that issue correctly?
Chair, I think a question related to this one should be raised. Why did sub-departments contribute and never got anything in terms of projects? And again, this is the anomaly I've been trying to explain, how a joint government model would operate. Some departments would contribute but not get anything in terms of projects relevant to their departments, because maybe government has decided there will only be 3 priorities If I'm at the Department of Education and there is nothing about education, in the interest of priorities of the province, I have to make my contribution.
But going back to my question, did I understand your evidence correctly? So what I said, there's no misunderstanding in terms of what your position, what you said earlier. Let me repeat.
Please.
Namely, I was saying, why were these funds removed from the departments? You know, said each department contributed. Were removed from the departments if they were still going to be used for the projects of those departments. Because it seems to make sense that if they are going to be used for the projects of those departments, that they remain within those departments.
And Chair, that's exactly the point I've just made.
Sorry?
The point that I've just made to respond to that question is, what about those departments who would have made contributions, but no expenditure would take place in their departments or related to the mandate of their departments? Simply because when you look at the list of priorities, nothing about their department is there, but yet they have made a contribution. So if you were to leave departments to keep their 10 million each, those departments that are not part of these priorities would not spend.
Well, I take it that the normal thing that one finds is that each department is allocated a certain budget for purposes of its projects for a particular financial year. And they are supposed to spend that money for the projects that they undertake. And that money remains in their departments. But obviously, the MECs of the various departments are supposed to play oversight over the HODs as to, are we spending the money that we are supposed to spend, and are we spending it for the purposes for which we are supposed to spend it? Are we acting within the ambit of the law, that kind of thing? And then the Premier looks at all MECs, all departments, and say to the MECs, I want to know what's happening in your departments. If he or she identifies certain departments that don't seem to be spending money that they are supposed to spend, or that seem to spend money on things that they are not supposed to spend the money on, then he would then call the MECs, the relevant MEC to account. Obviously, MEC would bring the HOD, what's going on. That's how the Premier would make sure that every department performs and spends money that it is given for on things that they are supposed to spend it on. And if a particular department is failing, fire the MEC, and the MEC can, I guess, fire the DG, or the Premier fires both the MEC and the DG, and you being Premier now, maybe that's the kind of thing also you look at, because you say you are given this money to spend. So if you are not spending this money, it means we are not going to be helping our people. So somebody must be fired if they are not spending the money.
Chair, taking 10 million from each department was to develop a pool of money that would be spent on priorities. And some of the departments that contributed the money, some of them would have projects relevant to their mandate, others would not. And as I tried to explain earlier, we are relying on a PFMA that operates on the basis of vertical or stovepiped system of accountability. And virtually every responsible government in this world are striving to find funding models that would say, we work together. And I'm sure the Commission would agree. There would be a need from time to time where departments have to go together, come together and address a common need or a common priority. And the critical question is, How does that get funded? When the PFMA operates in terms of a vertical system of accountability. And I think this is how I get trapped into something that I have no responsibility for.
Yes. Okay, Ms. Hofmeyer, as we have taken, but I think we must finish with him because
Indeed, I really
yeah.
have only a few more
Yeah.
questions. I've just been reminded that I left a question that I should have followed up on, Professor Mokgoro. It relates to page 95. 95 contains the invoice that came to you with that letter asking you to process the payment. Now, I asked you about the handwriting on that page. Can you identify whose handwriting that is?
Chair, I have been grappling with that very question, and I've not been able to. I then asked, and that was only recently, for documents which I was struggling to get from Ms. Patudi's department, and I got a document which I still have to go through to find out, because I've been in pursuit of this signature. I cannot tell whose signature it is.
You see, what's curious about that writing and the date of it is this is the only reference that we could find to anything about Treasury approval. You see, it says, I don't even know if that's TEI, I don't know who it's addressed to, but it says, please process this payment for 50 million, the payment amount agreed to with Treasury and at Exco, right? You say that you relied on that handwriting to authorize 50 million, because you'll see the tax invoice is not for 50 million, it's for a different amount. It's an amount of 53,143,564 rand, correct?
Again, my understanding of the word process presupposes that a decision had been taken earlier, and I was privy to the decision. So it was not like this thing was sprung from nowhere, and I was asked to process.
But is it usual to get invoices and then just see handwritten notes about paying less than the invoice and then authorizing those payments?
If there is no history or background to this, it is not reasonable.
And why 50 million? Why not the 53? Because the next month you had to pay another 60 million, correct?
Yes, I have no recollection why the 50.
And did you make any inquiries at the time?
I could have made that inquiry.
See, the other strange thing about the invoice, and I just put it to you so that you can assist us, the letter that was addressed to you on the previous page, 94, is a letter that was signed by the head of department on the 16th of March, 2015. Do you see that?
Yes, I do, Chairman. Chair.
See, the invoice is dated the 24th of March. You can't see that easily on the copy you've got, but we did get a better copy from your office yesterday. So I can assure you, Professor Mokgoro, it's in the top left-hand corner. It says March 24, 2015. How could you have been provided with an invoice dated the 24th of March on the 16th of March when you got the request for payment?
Doesn't add up.
Doesn't add up, does it? No. So you got asked to process payment on the 16th. For some reason, an invoice dated the 24th then appears with handwriting that we can't identify that asks you to pay 50 million, and you ultimately authorize the 50 million, correct?
I did not authorize it. I processed it.
Oh,
So when
okay.
you said
I'm
on...
sorry. I'm sorry. You say you did not authorize it, you processed it. Is that the payment?
Yes, Chair, because decision had already been taken. There had been discussions, presentations that preceded this. So it was only after Treasury had come into the picture to assist the Department of Community Safety and Transport Management that it was arrived at that 50 million would be the one to assist the resuscitation of the air flight.
I'm just trying to understand the fact that you say you did not authorize it, you processed it, because I thought all along it was a given that you authorized, but I may have misunderstood. Was the power to authorize payments out of this ring-fenced or these ring-fenced funds, did that power not lie with you?
Well, again, it is a tricky question of accounting officer.
Yeah.
Because the accounting officer is the one who normally authorizes payments. And we are talking about a model that is an anomaly. It is a necessary model I want to submit. But it is an anomaly because somehow or the other, it is not facilitated by the manner in which the PFMA exists, because it identifies an accounting officer who then becomes answerable for all decisions that are taken, especially expenditure. Now here you have a situation, and I know that I'm sounding like a scratch record. Here you have a situation, and if the Commission could apply its mind to this, why is a critical element of accounting and of expenditure, such as procurement, whether it is legitimate or not legitimate, why is it placed in the hands of an accounting officer in another department, the department that is the implementer of what Exco has decided should happen?
In the documents that a government department must retain for purposes maybe of the Auditor General's work, would there not be a document that reflects who authorized payment? In other words, if somebody says there's 50 million rand that was paid to SA Express, I want to find out who authorized that payment, would there not be documents that will reflect that so-and-so would have authorized? Generally speaking.
Generally speaking, yes, there should
Yes,
be there should be evidence
Yes.
of who authorized.
Yes.
And if I may, Chair, perhaps the Auditor General is one institution that could advise us as to, once you go the route of joint government, how do you deal with the question of accountability?
But in regard to this particular payment, is it fair to expect that somewhere there ought to be a document that reflects who authorized the payment?
I can only say that the one who authorizes payment is the one who is accountable for the
Yes.
expenditure.
Yes, but what I'm saying is, it's fair to expect that at some stage or another, even if that document is not there now, at some stage or another, there ought to have existed a document that would reflect who authorized the payment.
Yes, Chair.
Yes, okay, all right.
Chair, I submit that there are legal questions that we're grappling with at the moment, and in due course we will submit to you that the PFMA makes it perfectly clear who the head of department is and what the responsibilities of that head of department as accounting officer is.
Yes.
In just foreshadowing, we will also make reference to page 97, because that's the page on which Professor Mokgoro has confirmed his signature appears, and that is the page on which the claim is certified as being correct, and the payment then was made through the bank account. Chair, I'd like to then just deal with one last aspect. Professor Mokgoro said that there was a decision of Exco that he was relying on. Is that correct, Professor Mokgoro?
That's correct.
I'd like to remind you that that decision, albeit that those minutes are curious in a number of respects, does say that the contract must be signed, does it not? Do you recall that?
Yes, I recall that.
Yes. You authorized this payment before the contract was signed, though, didn't you?
It's possible, Chair.
Yes, your sworn statement confirms that you authorized the payment without a signed contract. So you weren't even implementing Exco's decision, were you?
Yeah, I recall vaguely, and I think we need to just to check on that one. I believe I recall that there was a question of launching that was given a consideration,
Sorry, could you
There
repeat that?
There were some timelines that informed the instruction to proceed with payment.
Yes, no, the timeline is as follows. You received that letter, plus the invoice for 53 million, on which in handwriting it said you must process a payment for 50 million, and you were given an unsigned contract. The only decision of Exco on which we can rely is a decision that says you can proceed to sign the contract. So the chronology is you authorized the payment before you had any signed contract, correct?
That the SLA was not signed is true.
Yes.
But I think the point, well, maybe not Ms. Hofmeyer's point, maybe it is her point, is the position not that authorizing payment in relation to a transaction where there's supposed to be a signed agreement, authorizing payment without a signed agreement in circumstances where there is supposed to be a signed agreement would be irregular. Would it not be irregular?
Chair, I think what we probably need to check, because I think that must have been a consideration at the time, where you have a transaction between government and government. That might have been a factor that weighed in.
But ordinarily, it should not happen.
Ordinarily, it should.
Yeah.
But Professor Mokgoro, you were the one who was making the decision. So did you take that into account? Did you say it's okay to authorize this payment because it's government to government?
I'm saying that because it is government to government, and because there have been these discussions that have taken place, and unfortunately when this service provider or this service provider was engaged within meetings that I did not attend, the totality of the issues at hand was such that because of the pressure, rightly or wrongly, to proceed with this project, I signed I gave the instruction for processing to happen.
Where was the pressure from?
Well, the airline had to start operating. I would have to check the records on a particular date, and I think that must have been one consideration why this thing had to be processed.
Well, that would only have come in the agreement that hadn't been signed yet, wouldn't it?
Yes, that is reasonable to expect.
Thank you. In conclusion, Chair, if I may, just put one or two matters to Professor Mokgoro. We started your evidence today with the Premier's inauguration speech in June of 2014. You'll remember that that committed the province to a whole lot of initiatives over the year. Do you recall that?
I recall that, Chair.
And then we moved to the MRRP project, which itself had a number of initiatives identified for the rejuvenation of Mahikeng. Do you recall that?
I recall that, Chair.
I'd just like to emphasize and highlight one or two of them. There was going to be increased security provided in Mahikeng, wasn't there?
Yes, Chair.
There was going to be water and sanitation infrastructure that was going to be improved, correct?
Yes, Chair.
There was going to be decaying electrification infrastructure fixed, correct?
Yes, Chair.
And for all of those initiatives, there was 132 million ring-fenced in the Office of the Premier. Is that correct?
Yes, Chair.
I'd like your comment on this, Professor Mokgoro, because what concerns me about what transpired is that 50 million was taken out of that ring-fenced amount, which was going to facilitate things like security, enhanced sewerage systems, better electrification, water and sanitation in the province, and it was put towards a subsidy to a government entity so that flights could come. Are you concerned about that?
Well, certainly I am concerned about a long shopping list of priorities, and in the end, when implementation takes place, that shopping list is not implemented, and the question of prioritization happens to be those who have been elected, and when they take decisions about prioritization, the implementers have a role to advise. but ultimately they implement.
Thank you, Chair. Those are our questions.
Premier, at page 97, before your signature, there is writing there, the way they made this copy, I think some words are missing, but I see the second line that says that the above claim is correct and that payment has not previously been made. I suspect that it must be meaning that what's missing is something like I certify.
I think so, Chair, because the last line in the Afrikaans, I think, has certificeer
Yes.
cut off. So I also intimated that it must say certify that the above claim. Correct.
Yes. Well, you would know this. Is that what's supposed to mean? You must have signed quite a number of the documents like this before.
What page are we on?
97.
Yes.
Yeah. At the bottom of the page, there is some writing there that appears above the date. Can you see that?
Above the date.
Above the date, yes. Can you see that there is, I think it's one sentence translated into 3 languages.
Yes, I can see the Chair, that
Yeah.
the above claim is correct and that payment has not previously been made.
Yes, I'm saying, looks like there are some words that have been cut off, but I suspect that with regard to the English sentence there, that probably what has been cut off probably says I certify, so that it would read I certify that the above claim is correct and that payment has not previously been made. You would know you would know maybe how these documents are used to read at the time you were acting TG?
No, I wouldn't have a recollection.
Yes, but would you think along the same lines as me? That
Possibly,
probably,
yes.
Yes. And if that is so, it seems to me, and I want you to comment on this, that the document contemplates that you need to make sure that you are not making a second payment in regard to as you are not double paying, so to speak. You are not making a payment that has already been made before.
Correct, Chair.
Yeah. And then where it says you certify that the above claim is correct, I wonder whether one should not understand that to mean you are certifying that making this payment will be correct. It's proper. It's legal. That kind of thing. Would that be your understanding as well, or would you have a different understanding of what this might mean?
My understanding is that a critical department had been drawn into the process of facilitating their making this amount available, and that was Provincial Treasury, apart from the department. So with the involvement of Provincial Treasury, I would have no reason at the time to doubt, given their constitutional role.
Okay. I assume that there is no intention to re-examine the Premier. Is
Chair,
that
we've
right?
just been exchanging
Yes, we have been
notes
talking
on the
about
point,
it,
so if I can hand over to my learned
Yes.
friend.
Yes, thank you, Chair. There is indeed the need to re-examine. If I may just illustrate, for example, the chairperson has already communicated that the impression concerning 2 amounts that were testified about, firstly of the 110 million rand payment, and compared to the 4 and a couple 100,000 that we talked about. When I read it, I would like to also get clarity from, and for purpose of the commission.
Yes.
Because the impression is that we could be talking about one and the same thing, when the other is talking about a startup fund,
Yeah.
and the other is talking about an annual fee.
Yes.
So if we leave it as these,
Yes.
it will create an impression that we are talking about apples when one could be a pear.
Are you saying you would like to re-examine,
We
but
would
you have
definitely
one or
like
two
to re-examine,
questions?
yes.
Would it be something as short as that, one or two questions, or is it much more involved?
It is a bit more involved.
Yeah, how
I have
much
flagged
time?
a number of things.
Yes, how much time do you think you would require? I'm trying to see, we were trying to make sure that we can release the premier when we go for lunch so that he doesn't have to come back and you don't have to come back
Yeah.
when we go to the next
When we
witness.
go to the next witness.
It might depend how long you are going to be, whether I allow you to start re-examining before we go on lunch, or we go on lunch and come back.
I will say, Chair, it is substantial enough. Part of the critical information that needs to be done, and I must take the blame that I seem not to be able to find the document. There was a question earlier on about the request for proposal, whether there was a process like that. And I can remember vaguely seeing a document of that nature. And it might be important that we get it, if we get it, then we bring it to the commission.
Yes.
So I do believe that a lot of, it is not going to be just a quick clarification process.
Yes, yes.
If an arrangement has to be made for that purpose, I will be in the chair's hands. But definitely it's not a question of just running through the mill with this thing.
Well, the re-examination in terms of the regulations must be for clarificatory purposes.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, in the commission.
Yes.
Strictly speaking, I wouldn't allow questions that are not aimed at clarification.
Yeah.
I would only allow those that are aimed at clarification.
Definitely.
So there is the question of whether you are suggesting that we release the premier and another day be arranged for you to re-examine, or whether you are saying, well, maybe let's adjourn and you would like to re-examine him after the adjournment. What would you like to see happen?
Could I perhaps, before I answer that, also have a minute to just confer with the Premier insofar as his time availability is?
Do you want to walk across and whisper to him while I am here, or did you want to have? We won't hear, I think, what you will say. If you are able to whisper,
let me just try to do that.
Approach him and whisper, and then let me know.
Thank you, Chair.
Professor Mokgoro, can I suggest you turn off your microphone just for the purposes? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. We have just discussed, I think, I want to put my head on the block and say that my re-examination will not take 30 minutes. And we can do that, perhaps let's do it after, let's take a break and do it after the break, so that I can just connect them quickly and eliminate having to go into unnecessary stuff.
Okay. Ms. Hofmeyer, what do you say?
Can I just seek a point of clarification from my learned friend? There seemed to be a suggestion that there is a new document that we haven't seen, a request for proposal. If that is so, we would need to see it. We certainly can't proceed to re-examination in a situation where we haven't seen the document. And Professor Mokgoro has a question on it. Is there indeed a document that we should see?
Professor Mokgoro has fortunately, in his bundle, has a copy of the request for proposal dated 5 August 2014. I saw it well. That may just be one thing. What we'll do with that document, because it's there, we'll send it to the evidence leaders. We don't need to clarify about it. I'll clarify about other things that I think need clarification.
Okay.
Yeah, and this document, the evidence leaders can consider at their own time, and if needs be, and a word is needed from Professor, that can be arranged. Yes.
Okay, I think then we must take the lunch adjournment. It's 29 minutes to 2. We come back at 2:30, and then there'll be the re-examination, and then after that we will then have the next witness.
Thank you, Chair. We may request an opportunity just to consider the document over the break, because it may be that we can deal with it then. It's unfortunate that it's being presented only now, but we can do what we can to make the process efficient.
Okay. All right, we are going to adjourn then for lunch. We will resume at 2:30. We adjourn.